This episode is supported by UK Test Hub. Visit uktesthub.com for free practice-style mock tests. Visit uktesthub.com. Tonight's stories are calm and easy to listen to, told slowly beneath the sound of steady rain. There's a gentle darkness here, familiar and unhurried. Everything continues quietly if you drift off. Story 1, Relentless Tailgate, Haunting Highway Pursuit. I never imagined a stretch of highway could feel so claustrophobic. I'd left the city around dusk, hoping to beat the worst of the weekend traffic. The plan was simple: get to my sister's place in the next state by morning, no detours. I was looking forward to the quiet, a break from the static buzz of emails and phone calls that had swallowed me whole the last few weeks. But now, as the miles piled up and the radio sputtered static between songs, something felt off. Not the highway itself, it's always been a ribbon of sameness, but the presence behind me. I first noticed a truck about an hour in. A large, nondescript vehicle with faded paint that looked like it hadn't seen a wash in months, maybe years. No logos, no license plate on the back, just a boxy shape with dull headlights that didn't flicker or flash, just stared. I caught sight of the driver once, a man who sat perfectly still, eyes fixed forward, unblinking. That alone should have been odd. People blink, shift in their seats, yawn. Not this one. Not ever. At first, I thought it was coincidence, that he was just another trucker who happened to be on my route. But the way the vehicle stayed glued to my rear bumper, matching my every move, was unsettling. I changed lanes twice, and each time he followed without hesitation. I slowed down, then sped up. The truck stayed there, like a shadow. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe the driver was just tired, or bored, or maybe I was just jumpy from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was there. Always there. The highway was mostly empty. A few other cars passed by, their headlights slicing through the dark like item. I caught the faint smell of burnt rubber and diesel fumes mingling in the cold night air whenever I rolled down the window to clear the stale cabin scent. The hum of the engine was steady, comforting even, but it couldn't drown out the quiet pressure building in my chest. I caught a glimpse of the truck again when I stopped at a rest area. I pulled in, brake lights flashing red against the cracked concrete. The truck idled a few spaces behind me, engine silent now, but the driver's face remained impassive. He didn't look away. I locked the doors and sat for a moment, pretending to check my phone, but my fingers trembled just a little. The rest area was deserted, save for a flickering street lamp that buzzed and hummed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden, then silence. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I was overthinking it. That the guy was probably just lost, or maybe had a personal emergency, or worse, was a ghost of my own paranoia. I laughed quietly at the thought, but it felt hollow. Back on the road, I kept my eyes peeled. I noticed small things, how the truck's headlights never dipped for oncoming traffic, how the driver's posture didn't shift even when the road curved sharply. No blink. No sign of fatigue. It was like he was watching me, waiting for something. I tried to focus on the radio to distract myself, but the static grew louder, mixing with the rhythmic thrum of the tires. I reached for my coffee cup, the one I'd barely touched during the drive. It was lukewarm now, the bitter taste a reminder that I'd been on the road far longer than I planned. The highway stretched ahead, empty and endless. I thought about pulling off at the next exit, maybe stopping somewhere well-lit, with people around. But the truck followed me off the highway, too. I saw it take the same exit, a silent shadow in the dim glow of the streetlights. My stomach clenched. I told myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that no one was perfect, that the driver probably had reasons I didn't know. but my gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror, to those unblinking eyes framed by the cracked windshield. When I finally reached a small town a few miles later, I slowed to turn into a gas station. The truck stayed behind me, idling on the main road as I pulled in. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the lock button on the door. The driver didn't look away. He just sat there, like a statue carved from shadow and diesel. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The scent of gasoline and fried food from the convenience store mingled with the faint hint of rain that hung in the night sky. I glanced back at the truck. It hadn't moved. I swallowed hard. Maybe I should call someone, but who exactly? The police? What would I even say? That a guy in a truck was following me? That he never blinked? It sounded ridiculous when I said it out loud. I walked inside, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the hum of the refrigerators buzzing softly. A clerk nodded at me from behind the counter, eyes tired but kind. I bought a bottle of water and a candy bar, trying to steady my nerves. When I stepped back outside, the truck was gone. The parking lot was empty except for a few other cars. I felt a brief surge of relief, but it was fragile, like glass about to shatter. I got back in my car, locked the doors, and stared down the dark road. Somewhere out there, the truck was still moving. Waiting. Watching. I didn't know what I was running from or if I was running at all. But the night was far from over. I sat in the driver's seat, the hum of the engine idling beneath my fingers, and stared at the empty lot. I turned the key again, this time to shut off the engine. The quiet was almost too loud, filled with the distant drip of water from the store's awning and the faint rustle of wind through cracked trash bins. I took a deep breath, the stale scent of gas and rubber mixing with the sharp tang of damp asphalt outside. My hands trembled slightly as I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up with a dull glow in the dim interior. No signal. Of course. This stretch of highway was a dead zone for anything resembling reliable service. I stared at the bars, willing them to climb higher, but they stubbornly stayed flat. I almost laughed at the irony. Here I was, stranded, with no way to call for help, no proof that anyone was even following me except my own eyes and the gnawing doubt in my gut. I shoved the phone back into the center console and leaned my head against the steering wheel. I needed a plan. Something concrete. Something that didn't rely on hope or paranoia. The truck. It had to have some kind of identifying mark, right? A logo, a license plate, a scratch, anything. I replayed the last time I saw it, the way the driver hadn't blinked, hadn't shifted in his seat. It was as if he was carved from stone, a statue watching me with empty eyes. That detail stuck with me more than the truck itself. Who doesn't blink? Who sits motionless for hours behind the wheel? I forced my eyes open when the quiet was broken by the crackle of a radio from the convenience store. A DJ's voice floated out, low and cheerful, talking about the weather and some upcoming high school basketball game. The mundane normalcy felt cruel, like a joke. Somewhere out there, that truck was still moving. Waiting. Watching. I needed to check the parking lot again. Maybe the truck had circled back, parked in the shadows. My legs felt leaden, but I unlocked the doors and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the first drops of rain falling in soft taps on the concrete. The smell of wet earth crept in, mingling with the faint aroma of burnt coffee from the store's vents. No truck. I moved toward the edge of the parking lot, eyes scanning every inch. A flickering streetlight overhead sputtered on and off, casting long, jittery shadows. The night felt alive, tense, something waiting for me to make a move. That's when I saw it. A scrap of paper, caught beneath a tire track near the curb. I bent down, fingers brushing the wet asphalt, and picked it up. It was a receipt from the convenience store, timestamped just 5 minutes before I'd entered. No name, no logo, just a list of items: water, candy bar, and a pack of chewing gum I hadn't bought. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Someone else had been here recently, maybe even watching me from inside the store. I pocketed the receipt and hurried back to the car, rain now falling steadily, pattering against the windshield with a steady rhythm. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There it was. The truck, reappearing like a shadow, close enough that I could see the driver's face in the dim light. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, unreadable. I tried to shake him off, weaving through lanes, taking every exit, but the truck followed, relentless. It was like a game of cat and mouse where I was the only mouse. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure the driver could hear it. I needed help. But who? I thought about calling my sister, Claire, the only person I trusted enough to tell something like this. But I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if it was just a coincidence? I pictured her face, tired but steady, and the calm she always managed to bring me. "Claire," I whispered to the empty car, "I think I'm being followed." I pulled off at the next rest stop, the truck still behind me. I parked under the sickly glow of a broken street lamp and locked the doors. My fingers hovered over the phone again. This time, the signal was better, a single bar blinking to life like a lifeline. I dialed. "Hey," Claire answered, voice groggy but warm. "What's up?" "It's late." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone's following me. Not just tailgating, but really following. For hours." There was a pause. Then, "Are you sure? Maybe it's just another trucker or something." "I don't know." "The guy doesn't blink. Doesn't move. It's weird." She sighed, a sound that mixed concern and that familiar practicality I loved. "Okay. Stay where you are. I'm going to look up some nearby stations and call you back." I hung up and leaned back, the rain now a steady drum on the roof. The truck was still there in the distance, headlights dimmed through the mist. A sudden noise made me jump, a dog barking somewhere near the far edge of the parking lot. The sound was sharp and unexpected, breaking the silence. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the rain and the low growl of the highway beyond. Minutes crawled by. Then my phone buzzed. "Claire. We found a patrol car about 10 miles north. If you can make it there, we'll call ahead." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "I'll try." I started the engine again, hands gripping the wheel tighter than before. The truck crept forward, like a shadow tethered to my own. Every mile felt longer, the night stretching out in front of me like an endless tunnel. I glanced at the receipt again, folded in my pocket. Who else was here? Who else was watching? And why did this all feel like the beginning of something I couldn't escape? The rain blurred the headlights ahead, and I realized I was driving not towards safety, but deeper into the storm. The truck stayed behind me, steady, waiting for me to slip. The rain had thinned to a steady drizzle by the time I forced myself back onto the highway. I flicked the wipers slower, as if slowing time might help. The road stretched out with a dull gleam, asphalt slick and reflective in the weak streetlights. I kept glancing in the mirror, the truck's cab a shadowed rectangle, the driver's face unreadable in the dim glow. No blink. No shift. Just that empty, unwavering stare. I swallowed hard. That wasn't normal. It wasn't even human. My phone vibrated in my pocket again. "Claire. Any luck with the patrol car?" I said aloud, though I knew better than to expect an answer. "Nothing yet," she texted back. "They're still combing the area. You don't have much time before this turns south." Great. As if it weren't already. I chewed the inside of my cheek, eyes flicking to the gas gauge. Half full. Not enough to keep running forever. The rain blurred everything into a watercolor nightmare, headlights bleeding into the sky, road signs melting into the dark. Every mile felt like a trap snapping shut behind me. I tried to think about anything else. But the feeling gnawed at me, something cold and methodical. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't just stalking me by chance. They knew the roads. They knew my patterns. How? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Or had I? No. Impossible. The receipt in my pocket burned against my skin, a small piece of paper, but heavy with secrets. I pulled it out again, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The timestamp was recent, just before I stopped. The name printed at the top wasn't a gas station or a diner. It was a company name I didn't recognize. A logistics outfit, according to a quick search last night. No phone number. No address beyond a vague regional office. I shivered. Whoever they were, they knew my route. My schedule. They were waiting for me to slip. A sudden flash of headlights from the opposite lane caught my attention. A semi-truck barreled past, its horn blaring as water sprayed over my windshield. The sound was jarring, snapping me out of my spiral. "Get it together," I muttered under my breath. "You're not just some scared kid." But maybe I was. The next exit sign appeared, a small rest stop. I debated pulling over, desperate for a break, but the truck followed too closely. Couldn't risk it. Not yet. Still, the idea gnawed at me. What if I stopped? What if that's what they wanted? To trap me in one place, to isolate me? The thought was suffocating. No, I couldn't let that happen. I kept driving, the rain picking up again, each drop pattering against the roof like a ticking clock. Then, a flicker. A movement in the passenger window of the truck. The driver shifted his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something tied to his jacket, a small patch embroidered in dark thread. I squinted, trying to make it out through the rain and distance. The word security stood out, faint but clear. Security? What kind of security detail followed someone like me at 2 a.m, with no lights, no markings, no identification? Panic rose, sharp and cold. I slowed briefly, heart hammering. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I could lose him here. But as I glanced back, the truck didn't slow. It matched me, steady and unyielding. I pressed the accelerator again, the tires hissing on the wet pavement. The road curved sharply. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. The truck stayed glued to my rear bumper, like a shadow refusing to let go. Then the radio crackled. Static at first, then a voice, low and distorted, "Pull over. You don't want to make this worse." I slammed my hand on the dial, turning it off. The sudden voice was a jolt, a confirmation that this wasn't random. Someone was watching. Someone was communicating. And they were close. My breath hitched. I glanced sideways. No other cars. No friendly faces. Just me, the road, and that unmarked truck. I knew the next exit was a dead end, a small town with one main street and nothing else. If I took it, I'd be cornered. But if I kept going, maybe, just maybe, I could reach the patrol car Claire mentioned. Except I wasn't sure anymore if the patrol car was real. Or if Claire was safe. Or if I was chasing a ghost in the rain. The storm's pulse quickened, thunder rumbling softly in the distance. I could taste the cold wet air in my mouth, metallic and sharp. My fingers trembled. I was running out of roads and options. The truck's brake lights flickered, then disappeared. For a second, the rearview mirror showed only empty darkness. My heart sank. Then the dim light that cast long, dancing shadows reappeared, farther back. But now, other headlights flashed behind it too, maybe 3 vehicles, all unmarked, all silent. I wasn't being followed anymore. I was being herded. The realization hit like ice water. There was no point of return. No safe exit. I'd crossed an invisible line, and now every mile I drove only tightened the noose. I swallowed again, forcing air into my lungs. The highway stretched ahead, empty and merciless. The night was closing in, and I was alone. I flicked the indicator and took the next exit, tires crunching over gravel. The truck's headlights followed instantly. Ahead, the small town lay waiting, dark streets, shuttered windows, and the faint glow of a diner sign flickering like a heartbeat. I pulled into the empty parking lot, every sense screaming. The truck stopped at the entrance, engine idling. The other cars pulled in behind it. I sat still, hands rigid on the wheel, waiting for something I couldn't name. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, a message from an unknown number. You can't hide. We're closer than you think. The screen cracked in my hand as I dropped the phone onto the seat. Silence. Complete silence. And then the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on gravel behind the car. The footsteps stopped just outside my window. The truck's engine idled behind me, a low, steady growl that seemed to echo in the silence. No other sound broke the night, not even the distant hum of insects or the occasional dog barking somewhere far off. The diner's neon sign flickered erratically, casting the parking lot in sharp pulses of red and blue. It blinked like a warning. I swallowed. The message, "You can't hide. We're closer than you think," was still glowing on the cracked screen, but I ignored it. I didn't want to give whatever was outside any indication I'd seen it. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came out shallow and uneven. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The truck's cab was shrouded in shadow, but the driver sat perfectly still, like a statue carved from darkness. Not a blink, not a twitch. Just unblinking eyes fixed on me through the glass. I had been driving for hours, chasing the illusion that distance could save me. But now it was clear. Distance didn't matter. This wasn't about a random tale. It was about control. About waiting. Watching. I reached for the door handle, fingers trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The thought of stepping outside felt like stepping into a trap. But staying inside felt like suffocating under a weight that pressed harder with every passing second. The footsteps moved again, slow and deliberate, crunching their way around the car. My skin prickled. Something about the rhythm, it was too steady, too measured, like rehearsed steps designed to unnerve. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there. The parking lot was empty except for me, the truck, and the shadow moving just beyond the diner's flickering light. "Who's there?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, rough and cracked. No answer. Just the scrape of gravel again. I leaned back, eyes fixed on the truck's silhouette. Then, from behind the wheel, a slow, deliberate blink. The driver's eyes. They moved. Finally. Not in the way humans do, not with the quick, involuntary flicker of lids closing and opening, but a slow, deliberate blink that seemed mechanical, unnatural. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of exhaustion creeping over me. Was I losing it? Was the darkness playing tricks? No. There was something about that stare, something too cold, too patient. I remembered the exits I passed. None were close enough to outrun this. No gas stations. No open stores. Just a dead-end town where even the streetlights had given up. Okay, I muttered to myself. Okay, think. My phone buzzed again on the passenger seat. Another unknown number. Another message. Stop running. It's easier if you just listen. I shoved the phone into my pocket and locked the car doors. The click echoed in the heavy silence like a shot fired in a cathedral. I didn't want to give them an opening. The footsteps retreated, crunching away into the darkness behind the diner. I could feel the truck's headlights shift slightly, swiveling as if tracking something else. I waited, pulses hammering in my ears, until the sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones faded, leaving nothing but the hum of the truck's engine and the steady flicker of the diner's sign. I had no idea how long I sat there, frozen in place, every nerve screaming to move and every instinct screaming not to. My hands went clammy, my mouth dry. The night pressed in, thick like fog, suffocating and silent. Then, a light blinked on inside the diner, a faint glow from a back room window. Maybe the place wasn't as abandoned as it looked. Maybe someone was watching. Or maybe it was just a flicker from a faulty bulb. I didn't want to find out. I wanted to leave. But I also couldn't drive with that truck lurking behind me like a shadow, waiting for me to slip. I started the engine. The truck's lights flared instantly. The driver's eyes caught mine once more, steady, unblinking, unreadable. I pulled out onto the highway, tires crunching on gravel before hitting the asphalt. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. The truck followed. I pushed the accelerator, the car lurching forward. My hands trembled, knuckles white against the wheel. I dared not look back again. The miles blurred. The night deepened until the world shrank to the thin strip of road ahead and the headlights behind. Then, without warning, the truck slowed. Not just a gradual decrease, but a sudden pull back, as if letting me run for now. I blinked, heart pounding. Was it a trick? A test? Or a warning? I didn't know. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. But something was changing. The chase wasn't just about following anymore. It was about control. And I was running out of options. Ahead, the faint glimmer of another exit appeared, swallowed by shadows. I had to decide. Stay on the highway and risk whatever waited in the dark, or take the unknown path and hope it led somewhere safer. I hesitated. The truck's headlights held steady, watching. I exhaled, sharp and ragged, and turned the wheel. The exit swallowed me whole. The road curved sharply, lined by dense trees that seemed to close in like a tunnel. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles crushed underfoot. My tires skidded slightly on the slick pavement. Behind me, the truck's lights blinked off. Darkness. Silence. For a moment, I thought I was alone. Then my phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with a message that made my blood run cold. You can't escape the darkness. The road ahead twisted tighter, disappearing into blackness so thick it felt like swallowing a void. I pressed my foot harder on the pedal. But the night was not done with me yet. The night air was thick and cold, pressing against my skin like wet wool as I pushed deeper into that unknown exit. The road narrowed, twisting between gnarled trees that scraped the car like fingernails on a chalkboard. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching, waiting. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was something colder, more calculated. The truck's driver hadn't blinked. Not once. It wasn't human, I thought, but that was ridiculous. I knew better. People like that existed, empty, relentless, and terrifyingly patient. My hands tightened on the wheel as the road curved sharply again. The scent of damp pine filled the cabin, mingling with the faint metallic tang of fear that rose in my throat. I swallowed it down. I needed to get somewhere safe, anywhere but here. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the road finally spit me out into a dimly lit parking lot. A small gas station blinked out at the edge of the clearing, its flickering neon sign buzzing against the silence. I killed the engine and sat there, listening. Nothing. No truck. No footsteps. Just the hum of a distant highway and the occasional bark of a dog far off into the woods. I didn't move for several minutes. The phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't look. I was too exhausted. My body was aching in ways I hadn't noticed before, tension knotting my shoulders, my legs stiff from holding the pedals too long. The silence was both a blessing and a curse. It let me breathe, but it also gave space for the thoughts I'd been pushing away. Why me? What had I done to deserve this? The driver, the truck, the messages, it all felt like a game I'd been unwillingly drafted into. A game where the rules were unknown and the stakes impossibly high. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. I remembered the first time I'd seen that truck. How it had mirrored my moves like a shadow. How the driver's face was impossibly still, eyes locked on me through the tinted glass. I remembered the fear that had curled in my stomach, how it had grown with each mile, each message, each unblinking stare. Was it some kind of warning? A threat? Or something worse, an invitation to unravel, to let my guard down? I opened my eyes and looked out the windshield. The gas station's flickering light cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. I debated going inside. I could use a break, some kind of human contact, but the thought of stepping out and meeting another set of eyes that might be watching, that was almost worse. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle from behind the car. My breath hitched. Slowly, I reached for the door lock, my fingers fumbling. The shuffle stopped. Hello? I called out, voice barely above a whisper. Is someone there? No answer. Just the rustling of leaves stirred by a breeze that smelled faintly of wet earth and something else, something metallic, faint but unmistakable. I sat frozen, every muscle coiled tight. The phone buzzed once more. I stared at it, unwilling to read the new message. Instead, I locked the doors and started the engine again. I didn't wait for the truck to reappear. I drove off, back onto the highway, my mind a jumbled mess of adrenaline and exhaustion. I thought about calling someone. The police, a friend, anyone. But what would I say? I'm being followed by a truck with a driver who never blinks and sends me creepy messages. I thought about how ridiculous that sounded, even to me. Still, I needed to do something. I pulled into the next town, a sleepy place with a diner still open. The neon sign buzzed overhead as I parked and stepped inside. The scent of coffee and fried eggs hit me, warm and oddly comforting. I clutched my phone, still locked, a lifeline and a threat all at once. The waitress gave me a tired smile. Long night, she asked, sliding a cup of black coffee across the counter. I nodded, trying to swallow the lump rising in my throat. You have Wi-Fi? I asked, voice rough. She pointed to a corner. Free, but spotty. I sat, the chair creaking beneath me, and finally unlocked my phone. The messages had stopped. For now. Relief washed over me, but it was shallow, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. I stared out the diner's window, the streetlights casting halos in the rain that had started again, droplets pattering against the glass like soft warnings. I didn't know who that driver was, or why they'd chosen me, but I knew I wasn't the same person who'd started this trip. Something had changed inside me. A quiet edge of vigilance, a sharper awareness of the shadows lurking just beyond the dim light that cast long, dancing shadows. I realized I'd been given a choice: live in fear, or learn to see the darkness for what it was, something human, something flawed, and something I could outlast. I stayed there for hours, drinking coffee until the sun crept over the horizon, burning away the night shadows. When I finally stepped outside, the air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of wet asphalt and new beginnings. I didn't see the truck again. I never got another message. But sometimes, when the night is still and the road stretches out empty ahead, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, searching for those unblinking eyes, wondering if the darkness ever really lets go. And I know, somehow, that the story isn't over. Not entirely. But I am. At least for now. Story 2, Forest Vigil, Unnatural Watchers on the Trail. I never thought a quiet morning in the woods could feel so wrong. The air was sharp and cool, still holding the dampness of overnight rain, but the sun was working its way up through the trees, casting long, flickering beams onto the mossy ground. The smell of pine needles mixed with something faintly sweet, like crushed wildflowers that had been trampled hours ago. I took a deep breath, trying to hold onto that mix, that forest quiet, before things started to feel off. At first, everything followed the usual rhythm. Birds chirped high above in the canopy, squirrels rustled through the underbrush, and the distant splash of a creek provided a steady background noise. I was halfway down the trail when I noticed the animals acting strangely. Not the usual sudden scatter when a human approaches, but a gathering. Small groups of rabbits, a few deer, even a couple of foxes, all frozen, their heads turned toward me with eyes wide open and completely still. That caught me off guard. Animals don't just stop like that. They don't stare with unblinking eyes as if they're expecting something terrible to happen. I stopped walking. My boots pressed into the soft earth, and the forest seemed to hold its breath with me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint, rhythmic crunch of my own heartbeat. I squinted against the dappled sunlight. The animals were spread out over a small clearing, maybe 50 feet across, but none of them moved. Their gaze was locked on me, unflinching. No twitching ears, no tail flicks, just a rigid, watchful stillness. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the sun. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't meant for me to see. I remember muttering to myself, "You're just imagining it." But even as I said it, my hands trembled slightly. I reached into my pocket for the water bottle and took a slow sip, tasting the faint metallic hint of the plastic. The forest smelled different now, less inviting. There was a dampness in the air that wasn't from rain, something heavier, almost like stale smoke or rotting wood. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks. The trail was narrow and winding, lined with thick ferns that brushed against my legs as I moved forward. The ground felt uneven beneath my boots, and every step seemed louder than it should be. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting the animals to vanish, but they remained, still and watching. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the cabin. I'd heard the locals mention it when I asked for directions, a small, weathered place, mostly forgotten except for the occasional visitor like me. Supposedly, it was surrounded by dense forest, miles from the nearest road. Perfect for solitude, or so I thought. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. The branches overhead tangled into a thicker canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of decay and wet leaves. Somewhere nearby, a crow cawed sharply, a sound that cut through the silence like a sudden crack. That's when I noticed the scratches. Thin, jagged marks etched into the bark of a tree just off the path. They looked fresh. I crouched to get a better look, brushing away damp moss and loose bark with my fingers. The marks weren't random, they formed a pattern, an uneven line that almost resembled letters. But I couldn't make sense of it. Just a fleeting shape, a hint of something deliberate. I stood up quickly, the hairs on my neck prickling. Maybe it was a hunter's mark, or some kind of trail sign. I'd seen enough hiking documentaries to know people did that to track their routes. Still, the quiet around me had thickened into something heavier, and the animal's unblinking eyes haunted the edges of my vision. I didn't want to think about who else might be out here. I pressed on, trying to ignore the growing lump in my throat, the way my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The air tasted faintly metallic now, like iron mingled with the cold breath of the forest. I wiped my forehead, surprised to find a thin layer of sweat despite the chill. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 30 minutes, I reached a fork in the trail. The signpost was old and worn, the paint peeling. One item pointed left, labeled cabin, the other right, trailhead. I hesitated. My gut told me left, but a voice in the back of my head whispered to turn back. I remember thinking, I'm already this far. What harm could a few more steps do? As I took the left path, the undergrowth thickened, branches reaching out like hesitant fingers. The animal's eyes seemed to follow me from the shadows, unblinking and unsettling. I stopped again, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No calls. No rustling. Just silence. Complete silence. Then, a faint sound, barely audible at first, broke through the quiet. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A low murmur, like voices carried on the breeze, just out of reach. I froze, my breath catching. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Probably hikers ahead, or campers near the cabin. But the voices didn't get louder. They didn't get closer. They lingered at the edge of hearing, persistent and hollow. At that moment, I realized the animals weren't warning me about natural dangers. They were warning me about something far more human and far more hidden than I could see. I stepped forward, trying to shake off the unease, but the forest felt different now. Thicker. Watching. Waiting. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to reach the cabin anymore. The forest didn't let up. I didn't want to move. But staying meant I was trapped, too. So I kept walking, head low, hands brushing the rough bark of trees as if it might anchor me. The dirt path was uneven, littered with twigs and dry leaves that cracked underfoot. The scent of damp earth and pine was sharp, almost overwhelming, but beneath it, something else lingered, faint, chemical, and wrong. I couldn't place it, but it set my teeth on edge. By the time I reached a narrow clearing, moonlight spilled through ragged clouds, silvering the tips of grass and casting long, skeletal shadows. That's when I noticed the first sign, something man-made. A piece of torn plastic, snagged on a branch, fluttering weakly. It looked out of place, like trash left behind by careless visitors. But out here, miles from any main road, I knew better than to assume it was accidental. I crouched and picked it up, the thin material crinkling in my fingers. There was a faint scent, something metallic and acrid. It reminded me of the smell inside old factories or warehouses, the kind of place where chemicals hang heavy in the air. For a moment, I wondered if I'd stumbled on a dump site, some illegal operation hidden in the woods. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Pulling the plastic taut, I saw a fragment of faded lettering, half torn away. I squinted, trying to read it. LTH was all that remained clear. Could be anything. Health? Wealth? No, that sounded too hopeful for this place. I stuffed the plastic into my backpack and moved on. The voices from before circled in my mind, whispered words I couldn't quite catch. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the way the animals had gathered, silent, watching, felt deliberate. Like a warning. Maybe they'd smelled something dangerous, or sensed people nearby they didn't trust. I kept thinking about that. People. What kind? What were they doing here? The cabin was supposed to be empty. I checked the registry at the ranger station earlier. No one had been logged in for weeks. Still, something wasn't right. That night, I camped near the edge of the clearing, reluctant to go any further. The temperature plunged, and the cold seeped through my jacket, wrapping around my bones. I brewed some tea on my portable stove, the bitter taste barely masking the metallic tang in my mouth. My hands trembled as I sipped, eyes flicking to the shadows beyond the firelight. Around midnight, the murmurs returned. Softer this time, almost conversational, like people talking low just beyond the trees. I strained to listen, but the words slipped away, unintelligible and clipped. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear more. Every instinct screamed to pack up and leave, but something else, curiosity, stubbornness, maybe a sense of responsibility, kept me rooted. The next morning I woke to an eerie quiet. No birdsong. No wind. Just the low, constant hum of the forest settling after nightfall. I pulled on my boots and headed toward the cabin again, determined to find answers. The path was littered with more signs of human presence. Footprints, partially washed away by last night's rain, marked the soil. They were fresh, no more than a day old, and oddly precise, as if whoever had left them was trying to avoid leaving a trail. Nearby, I found a discarded water bottle, half buried in moss. It was unremarkable until I saw the label, a local brand, one only sold in the nearest town, a good 20 miles away. Why was someone coming here? And who? The forest seemed to close in tighter as I neared the cabin. The trees grew denser, their trunks thick with moss and vines that clawed like fingers. The air smelled stale, like something had been decaying nearby. My skin prickled again, this time with cold sweat and a creeping sense of dread. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, it was worse than I expected. The building looked abandoned, but not in the usual way. The windows were boarded up, crude wooden planks nailed haphazardly, some hanging loose. The door sagged on its hinges, barely holding against the weight of years of neglect. But the ground around it told another story. There were signs of recent activity, trampled grass, broken twigs, and what looked like a hastily constructed shelter made from branches and tarps. I crouched low and noticed something else. Scratches on the doorframe, deep, uneven gouges that didn't look natural. Someone had been trapped here, or trying to keep something out. A sudden rustle made me jump. I spun toward the sound, heart hammering. But there was nothing. Just a squirrel darting up a tree, its tiny claws scraping bark. I laughed nervously, trying to shake the tension. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Not by animals this time, but by people. I circled the cabin, scanning for any sign of who might have been here. On the far side, partially hidden by undergrowth, I found a pile of belongings, a threadbare sleeping bag, a rusted metal canteen, and a notebook, its cover stained and edges worn. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. Most were filled with illegible scribbles and what looked like maps or sketches of the surrounding area. One entry caught my eye. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. They're coming. Not the rangers, not the hikers. Something worse. I can't trust the others anymore. The animals watch, but they don't understand. I don't know how much longer I can stay hidden. My hands trembled as I closed the notebook. I stared at the cabin, the shadows pooling beneath it. Whoever had been here was scared. Terrified, maybe. And for good reason. I thought about turning back, about leaving this place behind. But something gnawed me, the need to understand, to uncover the truth. The animals had warned me. The voices had whispered. And now, the cabin spoke in silence. Just as I was about to leave, a sharp crack echoed from the forest. Try, deliberate. Like a branch snapped underfoot. I froze, every muscle taut. The shadows shifted. Something moved. Not an animal. Someone. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter and cold. My eyes darted between trees, searching for the source. The forest held its breath, waiting. And I realized then that I was no longer alone in these woods. The storm was gathering. The notebook felt heavier in my hands than it had just moments ago, like the weight of its words wasn't just on the thin pages but settled deep inside my chest. The cabin loomed behind me, dark and still except for the faint rustling of leaves stirred by a breeze that did little to cool the warmth of unease crawling up my spine. I stood motionless, the rough bark of a nearby pine pressing into my back, and tried to make sense of what I just read. They're coming. Not the rangers, not the hikers. Something worse. The words circled in my mind, refusing to settle. I can't trust the others anymore. Who were the others? And how many? The scribbles looked like panicked, messy loops and crossed-out phrases that suggested a mind unraveling faster than the pen could keep up. I swallowed hard, the metallic taste of old leaves and damp earth filling my mouth. I looked back toward the trail I'd taken. It was narrow, tangled with roots and low branches, disappearing into thick woods that seemed darker now than before. The thought of turning around flickered briefly but died on my tongue. I knew the truth wouldn't come by retreating. The animals had warned me. The notebook whispered secrets. I had to keep going. A sudden rustle to my left made me freeze. A small group of deer stood barely 10 yards away, their bodies perfectly still except for their eyes, wide, unblinking, locked on me like they were trying to tell me something urgent. Their ears twitched, but they made no sound. I blinked, uncertain if I'd imagined their intensity, but they stayed put, watching with an almost human awareness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I shifted, trying to ignore the chill creeping down my spine. My feet crunched softly on dry twigs as I moved toward the cabin's front. The wooden porch creaked underfoot, and the faint scent of stale smoke and mildew drifted through the cracked window. Inside, shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. I didn't want to step in, but curiosity was a stronger pull than caution. The door groaned softly as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting after years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the kind that settles in places forgotten by time. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of my flashlight, and the faint smell of something metallic, old sweat, maybe made my stomach turn. The cabin was small, cramped. A wooden table stood in one corner, scattered with torn scraps of paper and a half-empty tin can that rattled when I nudged it. I rifled through the papers. More maps, notes I couldn't fully decipher, and a few photographs. One caught my eye, a grainy image of a group of people, faces blurred but their eyes sharp and watchful. They stood in a circle deep in the woods, heads bowed as if in silent agreement or mourning. The edges of the photo were curled and stained, like it had been carried around for a long time, maybe hidden away for fear of discovery. A sudden sound made me freeze again. A low, guttural growl, not animal, not quite human either, echoed from outside. My breath caught. The deer were gone. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and suffocating. The kind of silence that waits for you to make a mistake. I stepped back outside, scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to press closer, the trees leaning inward like they were overhearing. My pulse thudded loud enough I was sure it echoed through my ears. I wanted to call out, but my voice felt swallowed by the dense air. Instead, I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. But that crawl, deep and low, had come too close to be a trick of the mind. I remembered the last entry in the notebook. I don't know how much longer I can stay hidden. Hidden from what? Or who? I realized then that the animals weren't just watching me, they were watching something else. Something I couldn't see. The notebook's author had been caught between two threats, the unknown that lurked beyond the trees and the people who betrayed him. Trust was a currency long gone in these woods. I glanced back toward the trailhead. The path I'd taken was no longer inviting. It looked narrow, tangled, and unfamiliar, like the forest had swallowed it whole. No footprints. No signs of recent passage. Had I really come this far? Or was the forest shifting around me? A sudden crack behind me made me whirl around. Nothing but shadows and the skeletal outline of branches under the moonlight. My hands trembled as I pulled the flashlight up again, its beam catching a flash of movement, a figure slipping between the trees. I swallowed my rising panic. No way to know if it was friend or foe. But whoever it was, they weren't alone. The air felt charged, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I needed to decide, stay and risk whatever was out there, or run and lose the chance to uncover the truth. But one thing was clear, I'd crossed a line. The woods weren't just a backdrop to a story anymore. They were the story. And there was no turning back. The notebook slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the porch. The wind picked up, carrying the faintest whisper of voices, fragmented, urgent, impossible to place. I pressed my back against the doorframe, eyes darting toward every shadow, every whisper of movement. The animals had been warning me all along. Now, the question was whether I would listen before it was too late. Beneath a sky swollen with heavy clouds, an uneasy stillness settled over the forgotten trail. The night air was colder than I expected, sharp and biting against my skin as I pressed my back harder into the rough wood of the porch. The flashlight slipped from my trembling fingers, thudding softly onto the floorboards, its weak beam flickering erratically. I caught the faintest glimpse of movement again, something, or someone, shifting between the trees like a shadow trying to hold its breath. My throat tightened, dry and uncooperative. I swallowed hard, forcing down the surge of panic that threatened to spill over. The notebook lay on the porch beside the light, its pages fluttering in the sudden gust that picked up, carrying whispers so faint they might have been the wind itself. But no! Voices. Urgent, fragmented, just beyond comprehension. I shut my eyes for a moment, willing myself to listen, to understand. The animals had been warning me all along. Their unblinking eyes, their stillness, it wasn't some eerie forest superstition. There was something real out there, something that didn't want me to find the truth. I needed answers. But I wasn't sure anymore if I wanted to uncover what was lurking in the dark. A soft rustle. Closer this time. I squinted into the blackness, every nerve screaming to bolt, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The hairs on my arms stood on end as a figure emerged between the trees, outlined by the moonlight. Not a wild animal. Not a ghost. A man, tall and lean, his face obscured beneath a worn cap, eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Hey," I said, voice uneven. "Who's there?" No reply. Just silence. I took a slow step forward, then another, the rough wood creaking under my weight. The man remained still, watching. Unblinking. The forest held its breath around us. "Look," I added, trying to keep the quiver from my voice, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to know what's going on." His jaw tightened. Then, finally, he spoke, voice low, gravelly, like he'd swallowed a handful of dirt. "You shouldn't be here." That wasn't an answer, but it was a warning. I swallowed again, blinking rapidly. "I've seen the animals. They're different here. They're all watching me." He shifted slightly, the moonlight catching the glint of something in his hand. Not a tool, but a flashlight, the beam suddenly flicking on and cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I felt exposed, like a deer caught in the headlights. "They watch because they know what's coming," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This place isn't safe. Not for you. Not for anyone who doesn't belong." My mind reeled. What did he mean? What was coming? Safe from what? I pressed, stepping closer despite the cold knot tightening in my stomach. "From people like me," he said, voice dropping further, "and people worse." A chill ran down my spine. I realized then that the threat wasn't some mythical beast or supernatural terror. It was human. Real. Closer than I'd ever imagined. "Why are the animals acting like that?" I asked, desperate to understand. "Why do they stare like they're warning me?" He looked at me then, his eyes sharp, almost fierce. "Because they can sense it. The danger. They've seen what's been done here, what's been left behind. Animals don't forget. They don't forgive." The weight of his words settled heavily. I thought about the quiet forest, the untouched paths, the eerie stillness that had felt wrong from the moment I arrived. And the figures slipping through the trees. The notebook with its cryptic entries. All pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to run as far away as possible. Yet something rooted me here, a stubborn need to finish what I started. To find out what had been hidden, buried beneath the moss and silence. "Tell me," I said softly, "what did you do?" The man's gaze darkened. "I'm part of this place. Part of the reason the animals are scared. We've been hiding, running from the law, from each other. Things got twisted. People disappeared. No one outside knows. It's quiet now, but not for long." His words hung in the air, cold and heavy with silence, thick and suffocating. I glanced beyond him, into the dense trees where the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The forest was no longer just a setting for my story, it was a cage, and I was trapped inside. A sudden crack in the distance, like a branch snapping underfoot. Both of us froze, eyes flicking toward the sound. Something moved faster this time, closer. I could hear it breathing, deliberate and steady. The man's hand tightened around his flashlight. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "You need to get back. Before they find you." "Who?" I demanded. "Who's coming?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward and grabbed my arm, surprisingly firm. "Listen," he said, voice urgent now, "there's a reason the animals watch. They're trying to protect you. But you're stuck here now. You have to be smart. You have to be careful." I pulled my arm free, my pulse hammering loud enough to drown out the night. "I'm not leaving. Not until I know the whole truth." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if accepting a challenge he didn't want but couldn't avoid. "All right," he said, voice low. "Then you're going to see something no one else has. Something real. But I warn you, once you see it, you can't unsee it." A gust of wind swept through, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the darkness deepening around us. We moved together then, silently slipping into the woods. The beam of his flashlight bobbed and weaved, casting long, flickering shadows that danced between the trunks. My breath came in sharp bursts. The sun was low when I finally reached the cabin, its tired beams stretching thin across the clearing. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, but beneath that, something else lingered, a faint, sour tang, like old sweat mixed with something metallic. My boots crunched over scattered needles and twigs. I stopped, listening. No birds. No rustling. The silence was thick, like the forest was holding its breath. I hadn't seen a single animal since the last bend in the trail. Where they'd been earlier, those deer, the fox, even that one raccoon staring at me for what felt like hours, I didn't know. They had vanished, as if their silent warning had been delivered, and now there was nothing left to say. The cabin stood crooked, half swallowed by vines and shadow. Its weatherwood was gray and cracked, the windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking underfoot. The door was locked, but not with a key. A heavy chain looped through the handle, fastened by a thick padlock. I ran my fingers along the wood grain, rough and splintered. The quiet was oppressive, pressing in from all sides, and I realized I was holding my breath. My heartbeat was a dull thump in my ears. The wildlife's strange behavior, those unblinking eyes, they weren't just warnings. They were signals, desperate and raw, but to what? I sat on the porch steps, the wood cold through my jeans. The forest was still. No wind. No birdsong. Just the faint buzz of flies, restless and mocking. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. I'd known better. Hello? I whispered, more to the trees than anything. Is someone here? The silence answered. I tried the door again. Nothing. I circled the cabin, searching for an open window or a loose board. The back door was the same, locked tight, chained. I stopped at the edge of the forest and looked back at the cabin, a knot twisting in my stomach. Then, a noise. A low, dragging sound. It came from the side of the cabin, near the underbrush. I froze, eyes narrowing, trying to place it. The dragging grew louder, deliberate. Something heavy moving slowly. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, heart stammering. The ground was soft, damp with recent rain. The smell of rot hit me, then a sickly sweetness mixed with the metallic tang I'd noticed earlier. I crouched and peered around the corner. A man. Thin, ragged, his clothes torn and stained. His eyes were wild, darting like a trapped animal's. He dragged a large, bulging sack behind him, the fabric wet and heavy. He looked up and saw me. For a moment, our eyes locked. No words. Just raw, desperate recognition. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees, the dragging sound fading. I stayed still, the cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I wanted to call out, to ask who he was, what he was doing. But my voice caught in my throat. The man wasn't a ghost or some forest spirit. He was real and broken. I sat back on the porch steps, the weight of what I'd seen settling over me. The wildlife had been watching for a reason. Not because of something supernatural, but something human, something cruel and hidden. The sun slipped below the horizon, the shadows stretching long and dark. I knew I couldn't stay here, not tonight. I needed to leave, to get somewhere safe. But the path back was empty, silent. The forest wasn't just watching anymore, it was waiting. I spent a long moment staring into the darkening woods, then reached into my pack for the flashlight. The beam cut through the gathering night, small and fragile, but enough for now. I stood and took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, sharp and bitter. As I moved toward the trailhead, I thought about the man, about what had driven him to this desperate place. The wildlife, the locked cabin, the silence, they were pieces of a story I hadn't wanted to see. But now I couldn't unsee it. I walked faster, the beam bouncing over roots and rocks, heart pounding with every step. The forest seemed to close in behind me, the trees whispering secrets I wished I didn't understand. When I finally broke free of the tree-line, the lights of a distant town flickered like a promise. I didn't stop until I was among the familiar streets, the hum of cars and distant voices filling my ears. Later, in the safety of a crowded cafe, I sipped bitter coffee, the taste grounding me. I told the barista I'd been hiking alone, that the cabin was just a stopover. I didn't mention the man, or the way the animals had watched me. Some truths are too heavy, even when shared. The experience changed me. I realized how thin the veneer of civilization can be, how easily the wild and the human collide in places forgotten by maps and time. The forest had spoken, not with voices or magic, but with the weight of human desperation and silent warnings. I never went back to that trail. I don't know what happened to the man or the cabin. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear the weight of those unblinking eyes in the quiet moments, reminders that some dangers aren't visible until you're standing right in front of them. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all. Story 3, Silent Pursuit on Route 9, Haunting Presence Revealed. The air on the bus smelled like a mixture of stale sweat and burnt coffee, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you leave. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, watching the city slide by in muted colors. The streets were barely awake, just a few early risers dragging themselves to work, dogs sniffing around trash bags, the faint smell of bacon frying from a corner cafe. There was a chill in the air, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes you pull your jacket tighter. I pulled my scarf higher, even though it made my neck itch. That's when I saw her. She was sitting 2 rows ahead, alone except for an empty bag on the seat next to her. Her hair was tangled and dull, like she hadn't slept in days. She kept glancing at the door, her eyes darting nervously, as if she was waiting for something or someone. I caught a glimpse of trembling fingers clenching the strap of her torn handbag. The bus jolted over a pothole and she flinched so sharply I thought she might cry. I looked away, pretending not to notice. I told myself it was none of my business. But I couldn't stop watching. The girl's face kept shifting as the bus stopped at each grimy corner. Her expression flickered from fear to exhaustion and back again. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I wondered what had brought her here, on this route that scraped the edges of the city where the buildings sagged and the paint peeled like old scabs. I tried to focus on my hands, which were clammy against the worn leather of my backpack strap. My fingers drummed an uneven rhythm on my knee. The bus creaked to a halt, and the doors hissed open. A man slipped in, his coat too heavy for the mild morning, his eyes hidden beneath a shadowed hat. He scanned the bus slowly, deliberately, before settling into the seat opposite the girl. She didn't look at him. Not once. The man pulled a folded newspaper from his pocket, but he didn't read it. Instead, he kept watching the girl, a faint crease between his brows. I swallowed hard. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension I couldn't place. The bus lurched forward again, the tires squealing against the wet pavement. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe this was normal, just 2 strangers sharing a ride. But something about the way the man's eyes never left her made my stomach tighten. I wondered if she saw it too, or if she was too caught up in whatever was chasing her to notice. The bus rattled on, the city slipping past like a faded photograph. At the next stop, a small group of teenagers clambered aboard, laughing too loudly, their voices sharp and brittle. They crowded near the front, filling the bus with a sudden burst of noise. I felt the tension ease slightly, the momentary distraction of their careless chatter like a break in the clouds. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. She looked smaller somehow, swallowed by the bus and the city and whatever it was she was running from. I wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I kept my eyes on her, willing her to be okay. The bus slowed again, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The man folded his newspaper quietly, standing as if preparing to leave. The girl's eyes finally met his, sharp and wary. I watched as they exchanged a few words, quiet, tense, and then the man stepped off, disappearing into the misty morning. The girl didn't move. She sat frozen, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles whitened. I glanced away for a moment, blinking against the chill that had settled deep inside me. When I looked back, she was gone. Just like that. No sign she'd ever been there except the faint imprint of her weight on the seat. I blinked again, unsure if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had. Maybe the morning fog was playing tricks. But the empty bag remained, and the lingering scent of coffee and sweat filled the air, heavier somehow. The bus rolled on, deeper into the city's forgotten edges, where the buildings leaned closer and the streets whispered secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I rubbed my arms, feeling suddenly exposed, like I'd stepped through a thin veil into a world that didn't want me. The windows fogged up as the heat from the bus battled the cold outside. I traced a finger along the glass, watching the droplets slide down in uneven paths. Somewhere ahead, a dog barked. Sharp. Lonely. The city breathed around me, indifferent and vast. I didn't know it then, but that day, that bus ride, was the start of something I couldn't turn away from, something that would pull me deeper into the city's shadows, where every stop changed more than the passengers. Where every face was a story I wasn't supposed to hear. I just thought I was going to work. The bus lurched forward, carrying me further into the maze of streets and secrets. Somewhere beyond the rain, a new chapter waited, whispered in the hum of tires and distant voices. The bus rolled on, its tires hissing wetly on the slick pavement. Outside, the streetlights flickered, struggling against the mist that clung to the edges of the city like a second skin. I hunched deeper into my coat, the dampness seeping through the fabric, and watched the faces around me shift again. Another stop, another shuffle of passengers, different, but somehow the same. Like pieces from a puzzle I hadn't yet learned to see fully. I pulled my notebook from my bag, fingers stiff and fumbling. The pages smelled faintly of ink and old paper, a comforting contrast to the stale bus air thick with damp coats and city grime. I scribbled down the details I'd noticed so far, the way the bus's route dragged me further into a neighborhood where daylight felt like an intrusion, and where the people's stories hung as heavy as the fog outside. That first passenger, the woman with the cracked voice who muttered about debts and missed calls. The man who stared out the window so hard it seemed like he wanted to tear through the glass. And now this new group, 3 teenagers crowded near the back, their whispered arguments punctuated by nervous laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes. I wanted to ask questions, but the words stuck to the roof of my mouth. The bus stopped again. This time, the doors hissed open to reveal a man with a limp and a battered messenger bag. He stepped inside, and the air shifted. His eyes darted quickly, landing briefly on mine before flicking away. Something in the way he carried himself, like he was walking a tightrope over an unseen abyss, made me uneasy. He settled a few seats ahead, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. The faint scent of tobacco and something else, something metallic, clung to him. I wondered if it was blood, or just rust. The thought made my stomach knot. I tried to focus on the streets outside, the peeling paint on the boarded-up storefronts, the way the rain pulled in uneven patches along cracked sidewalks. But my attention kept snapping back to the passengers, to the way their faces blurred and reformed, like reflections in a cracked mirror. None of them looked directly at me, but I could feel their gazes in the corners of my eyes, sharp and wary. The bus rumbled forward again, and I caught a glimpse of a torn flyer plastered to a lamppost. The words were faded, but I made out community meeting tonight, 7 p.m., scrawled beneath a hastily drawn map. I jotted it down, thinking maybe it was worth checking out. If this city was hiding something, maybe those meetings were where the cracks showed. A sudden jolt threw me against the seatbelt strap. Someone had pulled the emergency brake. The bus groaned to a stop in the middle of a narrow street. Outside, the fog had thickened, turning the world into a blur of gray shadows. The driver muttered something under his breath, a string of words I couldn't catch, then climbed down to check. I exhaled slowly, breath fogging the window as I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. The street outside was deserted except for a stray cat slinking between trash cans. But then I noticed the buildings, tall, narrow tenements that leaned inward, their windows dark and empty like eyes refusing to see. I glanced around the bus. The passengers were unusually quiet, faces taut, eyes flicking toward the open door and back again. The man with the limp shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched so tight I thought I might hear the snap of bone. The teenagers exchanged quick, anxious glances, and the woman from earlier pulled her scarf up over her mouth as if to hide her breathing. A cold breeze swept through the open doors, carrying with it the faintest hint of smoke and something else, something sour, like rot. I swallowed hard, the taste sudden and unwelcome. You probably think I'm imagining things. The driver's footsteps echoed as he returned, shaking his head. No idea what's causing the blockage, he said, voice low. Might be debris or a stalled car. Could be a while. A murmur rippled through the passengers, tension coiling tighter in the air. I felt my hands tremble, fingers curling into a fist on my knee. The bus was no longer just a vehicle, it was a cage, rattling and immobile in the heart of a neighborhood that seemed to hold its breath. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words stuck again. Instead, I watched the man with the limp. He slid from his seat and moved toward the front, eyes scanning the driver with something close to desperation. Is there a way around? He asked, voice low but urgent. Not that I know of, the driver replied. This street's the only route in this part of town. The man's jaw tightened. I have to get somewhere. Can't wait. He hesitated, then turned back to the rear, his steps uneven but determined. The bus shuddered as a distant shout broke the quiet, a single voice raised in anger or warning, I couldn't tell. The sound bounced between the buildings, distorted and strange. I felt the bus's interior temperature drop, the warmth retreating as the shadows outside seemed to reach in, stretching long fingers toward the windows. The passengers shifted again, subtly but undeniably. Faces blurred, voices lowered, and the fragile calm fractured. The teenagers whispered now, their words sharp and fragmented. Did you see that? One asked, eyes wide. The guy down the block? He was staring right at us. No, another replied, voice shaking. Maybe it was someone else. I swallowed hard, the rising knot in my stomach pulling tight. Something was wrong, but I couldn't name it. The city was closing around us, the forgotten places folding in like a trap. I opened my notebook, fingers trembling as I wrote, something's here. Not just the city's edges. Something else. Watching. The bus's engine hummed uncertainly. The driver tapped the steering wheel, restless. The man with the limp returned to his seat, face pale but set. The woman's scarf slipped down, and I caught a glimpse of eyes glistening with tears or rain. I didn't know how long we'd been stopped, minutes, maybe more. Time had folded, stretched thin. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the street lamp's glow. Then, a sudden movement caught my eye. Across the street, a window flickered with light, not from the overhead bulbs or passing cars, but from something inside. A figure stood there, watching. Not moving. Just watching. I blinked, and the light went out. Silence. Complete silence. Then the bus's engine sputtered back to life. We moved again. But I knew, deep inside, that the city hadn't released us. Not yet. The bus lurched forward, its tires squealing faintly against wet pavement. The engine's hum had shifted, no longer steady but hesitant, like a thing holding its breath. I gripped the edge of my seat, fingers digging into the cracked vinyl. Outside, the city dissolved into shadows deeper than usual, the street lamps flickering like worn-out bulbs on their last flicker. It was cold inside now. Not the kind of cold you blame on the weather, but something else, something that felt like it seeped into your bones. I looked around. The passengers had changed again. Not just the faces, but the atmosphere. The air felt thicker, heavier. The teenagers from before were gone. In their place sat a man whose eyes darted restlessly, a woman clutching a threadbare handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. A kid, no older than 10, stared out the window, lips pressed into a thin line, chewing gum in slow, deliberate pops. The bus smelled different, too, a mix of stale sweat, cigarette smoke, and something faintly metallic that made my stomach turn. I swallowed hard. Something was definitely wrong. The driver's hands tapped the steering wheel with a nervous rhythm, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than necessary. I caught his gaze once, but he looked away fast, like he'd been caught doing something forbidden. Next stop, he muttered, voice low, almost a whisper. Where exactly are we going? I asked, voice tight. He didn't answer. The bus slowed to a stop at a corner I didn't recognize, a narrow street flanked by crumbling brick buildings, their windows boarded or shattered. The streetlights here flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows that crawled across the pavement. The passengers shifted again. The man with restless eyes stood up abruptly, knocking his bag to the floor. The woman tightened her grip on her purse, her gaze locked on the exit doors like they were a lifeline. The kid didn't move, but I could see the tension in the way his shoulders twitched. The doors hissed open. A cold draft swept through the bus, carrying with it the smell of damp concrete and something else, something I couldn't place but made my skin prickle. Everyone off, the driver said, voice sharper now. I blinked. Everyone? The man was already stepping down, glancing back over his shoulder like he expected someone to follow. The woman hesitated, then joined him, her purse swinging from one hand. The kid looked at me briefly, eyes wide and unblinking, then slipped past. I stayed seated, heart hammering. I wanted to move, to get off this bus, but my legs felt frozen. The driver's eyes found mine again, and this time there was something in them, an unspoken warning or a plea. Maybe both. Come on, he said quietly. This is where it ends. The words hit me like a punch. The last stop, then? No turning back? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog creeping into my thoughts. Why here? He hesitated, then said, because it's the only place left. The city's forgotten. The ones who don't belong anywhere else. I glanced at the other passengers now gathered near the doors. Faces worn thin by exhaustion, fear, and resignation. People who'd slipped through the cracks, swallowed by the city's dark underbelly. The driver stepped aside, gesturing for me to follow. I stood, legs shaky but moving forward, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The cold air hit me as I stepped off, sharp and biting, pressing against my skin like a warning. The street was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from broken gutters. I looked back at the bus. The headlights cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of the driver or passengers. The doors closed with a soft thud, and the bus pulled away, disappearing into the night. I was alone. Or so I thought. A voice whispered from the shadows, low and urgent. You don't know what you're in for. I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. Just the empty street and the cold pressing in from every side. I took a shaky breath and started walking, the weight of the city's forgotten pressing down on me, dragging me deeper into a place I couldn't escape. The point of no return wasn't just a stop on a bus route. It was a line drawn in the darkness, and I'd crossed it without even realizing. The night stretched ahead, endless and unforgiving. The cold didn't let up. It clawed at my skin, stealing the air with a sharpness that made each breath a small battle. The streetlights flickered, one after another, like the city's heartbeat was slowing, stuttering. I kept walking, uneven steps on cracked pavement, the faint drip of water from a broken gutter somewhere behind me. The voice, the whisper, echoed in my ears, low and urgent. You don't know what you're in for. I wanted to believe it was just the wind or my imagination. Maybe it was. But something about the way it cut through the silence made me freeze, my hands tightening into fists. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street, the distant hum of traffic, and the cold pressing in from every side. My breath came out in ragged puffs, tasting like metal and wet stone. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite the skin but seeped deeper, into the bones. The city had changed. Or maybe it had always been like this, and I was only just seeing the cracks beneath the surface. I tried to shake the feeling, the growing weight squeezing my chest. I'd crossed some invisible line, one I didn't even know existed until it was behind me, like a trap snapping shut. The bus had vanished, swallowed by the night, but the passengers, the stories, the shifting faces, they weren't gone. They lingered, tangled in the shadows and the silence. The street was empty except for a figure leaning against a lamppost a few yards ahead. The light above flickered, casting half his face into shadow. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. His jacket was worn, patched with mismatched fabric. He lifted his head slowly, eyes catching mine. There was something in the way he watched me, neither welcoming nor hostile, just expectant. Lost. His voice was low, almost a murmur. I hesitated. Maybe. He pushed off the pole, stepping into the weak glow of the streetlight. The smell of damp concrete and stale sweat hit me, sharp and unpleasant. This part of town doesn't take kindly to strangers, he said, voice rough like gravel. Especially ones poking around where they shouldn't. I swallowed hard. I'm not looking for trouble. He chuckled, but it was hollow. Trouble's what you'll find, whether you want it or not. He looked past me, eyes narrowing at the darkness behind. You're playing a dangerous game. The city doesn't just forget. It buries. I felt the cold tighten around me again, the way the shadows seemed to lean closer, listening. I don't have a choice. Everyone thinks that at first. He stepped closer. But choice means something. Right now, you're just a piece on the board. And the board's tilted. His gaze dropped to my hands, trembling slightly. You can't see it yet, but you're sinking. The sound of footsteps echoed from the alley beside us. Slow, deliberate. The man's eyes flicked toward the noise. You need to move. Now. Before I could ask why, a second figure emerged, a woman, mid-30s, her coat threadbare but clean. Her face was sharp, ice cold and calculating. She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped between me and the first man, blocking my view. You shouldn't be here, she said, voice clipped. Not tonight. Why? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She glanced around, then leaned in, whispering like she was sharing a secret. Because they're watching. Always watching. The city's got eyes, and they don't blink. Her breath smelled faintly of peppermint and something metallic like a coin. You don't want to be the one who draws their attention. I blinked, confusion pooling behind my ribs. Who? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. The first man stayed, eyes locked on mine. She means the Watchers. People who thrive in the cracks. His voice lowered, urgency threading through the words. They're not ghosts or stories. They're real. And they don't like strangers poking their noses in. I nodded slowly, the pieces clicking together but still fuzzy, like a half-remembered dream. So what do I do? He shrugged, a gesture heavy with resignation. You keep moving. But not like before. Like you belong. Like you're part of the city's pulse, not a visitor lost in the dark. I tried to steady my breathing, the cold suddenly feeling less like an enemy and more like a warning. And if I don't? He smiled then, a slow, sad curve of his lips. Then you become part of the darkness. And that's a place no one comes back from. The streetlight sputtered, the bulb flickering violently before plunging us into near darkness. For a moment, the city's breath held still, as if waiting. My skin prickled, every nerve taut. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the drip of water, the faint rustle of something moving just beyond the shadows. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The man's eyes followed, unblinking. Good, he said. Now listen carefully. You're not just traveling through this city. You're unraveling it. Each route, each stop pulls back another layer. Some you want to see. Others you don't. I swallowed again, the metallic taste lingering. What do you mean? Look around. He gestured broadly to the city, to the cracked pavement, the flickering lights, the empty windows. This place is a maze. Not just streets and buildings, but lives tangled and forgotten. People with stories that don't end cleanly. You think the bus was just a bus. It's a trap. A way to draw you deeper. His voice dropped to a whisper. And now, they know you're here. The hairs on my arms stood up. Who? He turned away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but a warning and the cold pressing in from every side. I was alone again. Or maybe not. The city's breath whispered around me, carrying the weight of all those forgotten stories. The bus routes, the shifting faces, they weren't random. Shadows stretched and twisted against the cracked windows as the bus traced a lonely path through the fading light. They were a map, a countdown, a descent into a darkness built from neglect and fear. I had no idea how far down I could go. But I knew one thing for certain, there was no turning back. And whatever waited in the shadows was patient, waiting for me to slip. The streetlight sputtered once more, then went out completely. I wish I were making this up. Silence. Complete silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered again. You don't belong here. The cold didn't leave me, even when the sky started to pale with early dawn. I sat on the cracked concrete steps outside the bus depot, the city's breath still heavy and damp around me. The metallic taste lingered at the back of my mouth, the same sharp, bitter edge from last night's warning. And now, they know you're here. The words echoed, not just in my ears but somewhere deeper, tangled with every uneasy glance I'd cast over my shoulder since. I didn't know who they were. That was the worst part. Not a gang, not some shadowy cult, or maybe it was all three and none at once. The city itself felt alive and watching, the peeling paint on buildings like skin stretched too thin, revealing bruises beneath. I pressed my palm against the rough wall, tracing the chipped plaster as if I could feel the pulse beneath it. Nothing moved. Or maybe it did, just too slow for me to see. I thought about the passengers. How every stop reshaped the bus like a living thing, the faces shifting, stories folding in and out like paper cranes, fragile and sharp all at once. I wondered if they were real. If any of them had noticed me. Did they know about the trap, the maze? Or was I the only one unraveling it, like some cursed thread pulled loose from a tapestry no one else bothered to fix? The air smelled faintly of damp cardboard and old coffee, a scent I couldn't shake from my clothes. I pinched the collar of my jacket, wishing it could shield me better. The city's noise started to rise, the distant hum of traffic, a dog barking far off, the creak of an old elevator shaft somewhere underground. All ordinary sounds, but loaded. Heavy. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the tension gnawing my stomach. I kept thinking about the man who'd spoken to me, the one who vanished like smoke after dropping that final warning. There was something about his voice, cracked but certain, like he carried too much history in his bones. Did he know a way out? Or had he been swallowed by this maze too? A sudden shuffle nearby made me jump. I opened my eyes to see a woman sitting a few feet away on the steps, her shoulders trembling, a thin scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She looked up, startled, then gave a half smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You look like you've seen ghosts," she said softly, voice rough like gravel. I laughed without humor. "More like shadows I can't quite shake." She nodded, eyes flicking to the street behind me. "They circle. Always watching. You're not the first to notice." The words settled between us, heavy and cold. I studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the tired lines around her eyes. She smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and peppermint. I wondered what story she carried, what layer of the city she was pulled from. "Who are they?" I asked, voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, biting her lip. "The forgotten. The ones who don't leave, even when the city tries to erase them. They're not all bad. Some just want to be seen." I stared at her, trying to understand. "Seen?" I repeated. "Sometimes," she said, "being seen is the only way out. Even if it means staying trapped a little longer." Her words twisted inside me. I thought about the bus, the routes, the shifting faces. Maybe the trap wasn't just about being held captive. Maybe it was about acknowledgement, about becoming part of the city's fractured memory. A chill wind blew down the street, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable smell of rain. The sky had darkened again, heavy with unshed clouds. She stood, brushing dust off her coat. "Be careful," she said, voice low. "The deeper you go, the harder it is to find the way back. But sometimes, you don't want to." And then she was gone, swallowed by the morning mist, leaving me alone with the weight of her words. I stayed there until the rain started, slow at first, then steady, drumming on the pavement and soaking through my jacket. The city's layers unfolded around me, the cracked sidewalks, the flickering street lamps, the distant murmur of lives I would never fully touch. The trap felt less like a prison and more like a mirror, reflecting back everything I tried to ignore. When I finally stood and walked away from the depot, my clothes clinging cold and wet, I wasn't the same person who had climbed onto that bus the first time. Something inside me had shifted, an acceptance, maybe, or a reckoning. The city's forgotten stories weren't just warnings or threats. They were a part of me now, tangled in the same way I was tangled in them. I didn't know if I'd ever escape this maze. Maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the real journey was learning to live inside it, to navigate the shifting faces and fractured stories without losing myself completely. The bus came again, pulling up with its usual screech, its doors yawning open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. For a moment, I hesitated. The faces inside flickered, some familiar, some new, and the weight of their gazes pressed against me like a tide. I stepped on. The city breathed around me, alive and watching. I was tangled, unraveled, but moving forward. Story 4, Forest of Forgotten Hikers, Haunted Trails Resurface. I never thought I'd miss the city's cacophony, the relentless hum of traffic, the chatter bleeding out of cafes, the random clatter of late-night footsteps on cracked pavement. We had started this trip with the usual talk of escape. I, desperate to forget the quiet, the creeping isolation of my life 6 years after leaving the force. The others, Maya and Simon, grinning like they'd lived their whole lives in these woods. They were supposed to be just backpackers like me, but after a day or two, their familiarity with every hidden trail and whispered local secret was impossible to ignore. We'll reach the old logging camp by dusk, Simon said that morning, sounding more like a guide than the easygoing guy he was. And after that, the path skirts the ridge where old man Fletcher disappeared back in '92, Maya added, her voice dropping a notch. They say the place still smells of burnt wood and stale whiskey. I paused, the words hanging strangely in the thin air. Burnt wood and stale whiskey? That was a detail I'd read somewhere, years ago. Not in a travel guide, though. The phrase had popped up in a missing hikers report I'd filed once, back when I was still a cop. A woman named Fletcher, gone without a trace somewhere in a patch of forest not far from here, or so the case file said. I brushed the thought away. It was just a coincidence. But the way Maya said it, almost like she'd been there, made my skin tighten. The sun was already high, casting long shadows through the trees, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I adjusted my pack, feeling the rough leather straps dig into my shoulders. The ground beneath my boots was soft but uneven, littered with pine needles and brittle twigs. Occasionally, a distant crow would caw, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness. The quiet was different here. Not peaceful. Expectant. I was the outsider in this trio, the one who'd only ever read about these places in dusty books and old newspaper clippings. Maya and Simon, on the other hand, moved like they belonged. They knew every nook, every bend. When we passed a fork in the trail, Maya pointed out the old hunter's path, naming a route I'd never seen on any map. Simon told me about the creek where the girl's footprint stopped, his voice low, almost reverent. I tried to keep up, asking questions that felt increasingly foolish. How do you know all this? I asked one afternoon, when the sun was dipping behind a veil of clouds, turning the sky a pale, bruised blue. Simon just smiled, like I was missing the obvious. We grew up here. Or close enough. Maya laughed softly. You don't remember, do you? We've been coming back for years. But I didn't remember. Not really. The details they shared matched pieces of a puzzle I'd pieced together in a cold office years before. The missing hiker's case, the one that never got solved. The one I'd buried deep after the trail went cold. It was unsettling, the way their knowledge threaded through the stories I thought were mine alone. I kept catching myself staring at them, wondering if I'd missed something crucial. A moment in the past where our paths had crossed, or maybe something darker. That night we camped near a creek, the water murmuring over smooth stones. I sat by the fire, the smoke curling up and biting at my eyes. Maya was tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, humming a tune that sounded oddly familiar. Simon poked at the embers, eyes distant. The village we passed through earlier was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten houses with peeling paint and shuttered windows. The locals had greeted us with polite nods, their eyes quick and darting, like they were hiding questions. I'd caught a faint scent of wood smoke mixed with something else, old leather, maybe, or something metallic. It lingered in my nostrils, stubborn. Ever get the feeling we're being watched? I asked quietly, not wanting to break the fragile calm. Simon shrugged. Paranoia's an easy trap out here. Maya glanced toward the dark tree line. Maybe. But sometimes, it's better to trust your gut. Her words settled in my chest like a stone. I didn't know what to think. The forest around us seemed alive with 1,000 unseen eyes. Later, as I lay on my sleeping pad, the cool night pressing against my skin, I tried to shake the unease that had settled deep. The stories, the knowledge, the way Maya and Simon spoke of forgotten trails and vanished people, it was all too precise, too intimate. Like they were reading from a script only they knew. I closed my eyes and listened to the night. A distant howl, the rustle of leaves, the soft breath of the creek. Silence. Complete silence. Somewhere out there, the past was still waiting. And it was watching us. A sudden crack echoed through the trees, sharp and unexpected. My heart jumped as shadows shifted beyond the campfire's glow, hinting that we were not alone. The crack in the darkness didn't come again. Simon shifted beside me, the scrape of his gear louder than it should have been. Probably just a branch, he whispered, voice low and steady. But even as he said it, I caught the faintest hesitation, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Maya's eyes caught mine from the other side of the fire. Maybe, she said, voice soft but firm. Or maybe it's something we don't see yet. I nodded, though my skin prickled. That phrase, something we don't see yet, echoed in my mind, dragging me back to the missing hiker's case I'd reported years ago. I'd never stopped thinking about it. A small group, like us, trekking through a maze of trails that no one outside that region seemed to know. Then nothing. No bodies, no clues, just silence. Only now, sitting here in the cold, the pieces felt less like coincidence and more like a puzzle slowly snapping together. By dawn, the forest was a muted gray, shadows retreating into the underbrush. The scent of damp earth and pine filled the air, sharp and alive with morning promise. I was the first to wake. The others still stirred in their tents, but I couldn't sit still. The night's tension settled in my bones, an itch that refused to be scratched. Outside, the ground was soft with dew. I knelt down, tracing my fingers over a patch of disturbed soil near the fire. It looked fresh. Footprints? Maybe. The shapes were faint but uneven, scattered in strange patterns, not the orderly tread of our group. My stomach churned. Maya appeared beside me, pulling her jacket tight against the chill. Find something? I hesitated. Maybe. Footprints. Not ours. She crouched, eyes narrowing. Could be animals. Or someone else. Someone else, I repeated, voice barely above a whisper. The thought twisted inside me. We didn't talk much as the others gathered, but the mood had shifted. The easy camaraderie from earlier was gone, replaced by something taut and watchful. Simon checked his map again, fingers tracing trails with a practiced ease that still unsettled me. Every name, every bend in the path he pointed out was familiar, not just to me, but to the missing group's last known route. How do you know all this? I asked, unable to keep the suspicion from my voice. Every trail, every hidden turn. Simon looked up, eyes steady but unreadable. I've been here before, he said simply. Spent time learning the land. Maya nodded. We all have. More than you realize. But I realized too well. That knowledge wasn't just experience. It was detailed, specific, impossible to have unless someone had been there at the exact times the missing hikers disappeared. Someone who knew the secrets they were desperate to hide. The day was spent moving slowly, our group weaving through undergrowth and tangled roots. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step, branches scraping like fingers against our jackets, leaves crunching too loudly underfoot. Every hidden trail Simon and Maya named felt like a page in a book I'd read before, one I wished I could forget. At one point, we paused near a narrow ravine, the air sharp with the scent of moss and wet stone. Simon knelt, pointing to a cluster of broken twigs and trampled ferns. "Here," he said. "They passed this way." Maya crouched beside him, eyes scanning the ground. "Recent. Not older than a week." I swallowed hard. The missing hikers had vanished months ago. Unless someone else had come after them, or worse, was still out here. My hands trembled, though I tried to hide it. I didn't want to show how deep the unease had burrowed into me. Why wouldn't they just follow the main paths? I asked, trying to sound casual. Simon's gaze was sharp. Sometimes the main path isn't the safest. Or the easiest. Sometimes it's the one people don't expect you to take. A warning. Or a threat. I wasn't sure which. Later, as we set up camp again near a shallow creek, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. The water's surface was smooth, reflecting the darkening sky, but the sound of the creek was almost drowned out by the thick silence around us. Maya sat apart from the group, staring into the distance where the trees grew dense and black. I joined her, the cool air brushing my cheek. "What do you think happened to them?" I asked quietly. Her eyes didn't leave the tree line. "People," she said finally. "Sometimes the forest isn't the thing that takes you. It's what's inside it." Her words pressed against my chest, heavier than any weight I'd carried in years. I wanted to ask more, to pull the truth from her, but the moment slipped away, swallowed by the coming night. That night, sleep was a stranger. The forest whispered in the dark, not with voices, but with rustling leaves and shifting shadows that played tricks on the mind. I kept waking, heart thudding whenever a branch snapped or a distant animal called out. And then, just before dawn, I heard it again, a soft sound, deliberate and slow, like footsteps padding over dry leaves. Different from anything we'd made. I sat up, breath caught in my throat. The others were still asleep, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge whatever was out there. My mind raced. Was it one of them? Someone watching, waiting? Or had the forest finally decided to give up its secrets? I reached for my notebook, hands shaking, and began writing down everything I'd noticed, the trails, the footprints, the way Simon and Maya's knowledge matched the missing hikers' last movements. Each detail felt like a thread pulling me deeper into a tangled web I wasn't sure I wanted to unravel. But I had no choice. Because now, more than ever, I was certain of one thing: the past wasn't just watching us. It was closing in. I sat there, the notebook clutched in my lap, fingers numb from the cold night air and the tremor I couldn't shake. There was no turning back now. The pieces I'd spent years trying to fit together, the missing hikers, the abandoned trails they'd taken, the last known movements I'd reported to police, were tangled up with Simon and Maya in ways that defied coincidence. They knew every hidden path, every whispered local secret, with a precision that was impossible unless... I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Impossible. But then, why did the names they dropped match the details I'd buried deep in my memory? The same obscure creek 3 miles east of the ridge. That forgotten marker carved into the bark of a twisted pine. The rust-colored scarf found snagged on a bramble bush, the one I'd never mention outside the investigation. I thought I was alone in this until now. The fire cracked louder, sparks shooting up like tiny stars. I breathed in, tasting the sharp tang of smoke mixed with wet earth and pine needles. The unmistakable scent of damp moss crept beneath the heavier smells, grounding me somewhere between curiosity and dread. I could almost hear my own heartbeat, thudding in my ears like a warning drum. I wanted to wake them. To say, "Do Do you realize what you're telling me? How much you know? But my voice froze. What if I was wrong? What if I was just projecting years of obsession onto two people who were nothing more than skilled hikers? The rational part of me whispered to wait, to watch, to gather more evidence before unraveling the knot. Still, my gut screamed otherwise. The night stretched on and the forest grew colder. I pulled my jacket tighter, the fabric stiff and scratchy against my skin. My notebook lay open, pages ruffling with the breeze. I read over my notes again, the names and coordinates underlined, circled, connected by item that looked like a spider's web. Simon stood beside me, stirring me from my spiraling thoughts. His eyes opened slowly, dark and unreadable. "Can't sleep either?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and picked up my notebook. His fingers brushed the pages, tracing the lines. "You've been keeping this a long time," he said quietly. "Years," I admitted. "I thought it was just me. That no one else cared." Maya shifted, her eyes blinking open, catching the exchange. "It's not just you," she said softly, voice low enough that it might have been a dream. "We've been waiting for someone who remembers." Waiting. The word hung in the cold air, heavier than the night itself. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I leaned back against the rough bark of the tree, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows. "You're saying you knew them," I finally managed. "The missing hikers?" Maya nodded, but didn't elaborate. Simon's gaze flicked toward the dark forest, as if the trees themselves held secrets too dangerous to voice aloud. A sudden rustle nearby made me jump, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal. I scanned the undergrowth, but saw nothing. The forest was alive, too alive, and every sound seemed amplified. The distant dog barked again, closer this time, urgent and sharp. "We should move," Simon said, standing abruptly. His voice was steady, but his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't place. "Not here." Maya scrambled up as well, grabbing her pack. "We're going to the village. There's someone we need to see." The words hit me like a cold wave. The village, the one we passed earlier, empty and silent during the day. Now it felt like a trap, a place where the past and present collided, and where I was no longer a visitor but a participant. I hesitated. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why act like you didn't know anything?" Simon looked at me then, face unreadable in the firelight. "Because some truths aren't safe to share. Not until the time is right. And because running from the past won't keep us safe." I swallowed hard, the chill crawling up my spine. I thought this trip was about discovery, about healing. But it was something else. A point of no return. The night pressed in, dark and unyielding. Every instinct screamed to turn around, to leave this tangled mess behind. But the weight of the notebook in my hand reminded me there was no going back. The past had found me. And I had to follow it, even if it meant stepping into shadows I couldn't escape. We packed in tense silence, the urgency unspoken but palpable. The forest seemed to close around us, every sound magnified, the snap of twigs, the whisper of wind through the leaves, the distant bark that now felt like a countdown. As we moved toward the village, I glanced back once. The trees stood still, dark sentinels guarding secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But uncover them I would. Because the missing hikers weren't just a cold case anymore, they were a warning. And I was right in the middle of it. The forest did not forgive hesitation. We moved quietly, the crunch of boots on gravel too loud in the stillness. I kept my hand wrapped around the notebook, its worn spine pressing into my palm, a cold weight of memory and dread. Every step felt like walking deeper into a trap I had helped set in motion years ago. Look at that, Mia whispered, voice low, her breath misting in the cold night air. She pointed to a narrow alleyway veiled in shadows. They called it the Devil's Run. Not on any map. But the locals swear it's where the last hiker disappeared. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. The name was too familiar. Devil's Run. I'd read about it in faded reports, the kind that didn't make headlines but haunted the margins of police files. I glanced at Lyle, who was staring at the same alley, eyes narrowed. Why do you know that? I asked, voice barely audible. Lyle smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because I've been here before, he said. Not just passing through. I know these trails better than anyone. That was impossible. I had been following this case for years, tracking every lead, every rumor. No one, not the police, not the search teams, knew these paths so intimately. Except maybe the person responsible. My pulse hammered in my ears. The cold trickle of sweat ran down my spine. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the village seemed to breathe around us, its silence thick and watchful. The street lamp flickered again, casting long, jittery shadows that danced like specters. Let's keep moving, Mia urged. We don't want to get stuck outside after dark. The houses were old, their plaster cracked and sagging, windows shuttered tight as if hiding from the night itself. A faint smell of stale bread and smoke seeped from a nearby bakery, now shuttered and silent, but the warmth it promised felt miles away. The village was a husk, frozen in time, and I felt like an intruder in a place that had already turned away from the world. As we passed a small square, a dog barked, sharp, sudden, breaking the night's stillness. The sound echoed oddly, as if bouncing off invisible walls. I glanced over my shoulder and caught sight of a figure watching us from a second-story window. The silhouette was too vague to make out, but the deliberate stillness sent a chill racing down my limbs. Probably just a local, Mia said, but her voice wavered. I didn't believe her. We reached the inn, if you could call it that, a squat building with a faded sign swinging in the wind. The door creaked open before I could knock, and the innkeeper appeared, a gaunt woman with eyes like chipped glass. You're late, she said, voice dry as sandpaper. Not many come through here at night. We're here for the trails, Lyle said smoothly. Hoping to rest and head out at first light. Her gaze flicked to me, sharp and assessing. You don't belong, she said flatly, then turned and disappeared inside without another word. I caught Mia's glance. We both knew what that meant. The village was closed off, suspicious. We were outsiders poking around in a story that didn't want to be told. Inside, the inn was a patchwork of dim light and shadows, thick with the smell of damp wood and old smoke. The floorboards creaked underfoot. We took a table near the hearth, where the embers glowed weakly, as if the fire was tired of burning. I sat down heavily, the notebook still in my hand. I opened it to the page I'd been studying before, the map, the notes, the names. They were all here. Every trail, every hidden clearing, every whispered secret. And every single detail was being recited by my companions as if they lived and breathed the forest. How? I asked, voice tight. You can't know all this. Lyle leaned back, eyes gleaming with something I couldn't place. I've learned, he said simply. Mia looked between us, tension tightening her jaw. I think you need to tell us what's really going on. The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. I found something, I confessed, voice low. Years ago. About those missing hikers. I thought it was a dead end, but now I'm not so sure. Lyle's smile vanished. Because you realize this isn't just a coincidence. Exactly, I said. Your knowledge matches the case files. Too closely. Silence. Then, a soft knock at the door startled us all. The innkeeper's head peeked in. "Visitors," she said, eyes sharp. "Not all of them welcome." I felt the room tilt slightly, the walls pressing in, the fire flickering as if warning us. The knot in my stomach tightened. Whatever had been lurking in the background was moving closer. Mia's hand found mine under the table, squeezing hard. We didn't come this far to turn back now. I nodded, though doubt gnawed at me. The innkeeper's eyes flicked to Lyle, then back to me. "You should know," she said quietly, "there are things in these woods that don't like being found. People have vanished before. Some never meant to be seen again." Her words were not a threat but a fact, cold and unyielding. The fire cracked louder, and I caught a glimpse of Lyle's face in the flickering light, calm, unreadable. But beneath that calm, I thought I saw something darker, something waiting. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows like restless fingers. The village seemed to hold its breath. I realized then that this night would change everything. The past I tried to bury was clawing its way back, and the people beside me were no longer just companions. They were part of the story, maybe even part of the danger. And I was trapped between the truth and the shadows that wanted to swallow it whole. The knock came again, louder this time. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a pair of eyes, cold and unblinking, staring in. "Time's up," came a voice from the darkness. My hands trembled as I clutched the notebook tighter. We were not alone. Not anymore. The knock came again, sharper this time, a deliberate hammering against the thin wood. "Time's up," the voice said, low and steady, a thread of menace woven through the words. The door opened just enough to reveal a pair of cold, unblinking eyes, dark pupils like pits, reflecting the flickering firelight behind us. I couldn't tell if they were human or something else. The face beyond the crack was pale, worn, and impossibly still, like a statue carved from bone. The moment stretched out as the silence pressed in. Lyle shifted beside me, his calm mask slipping for a fraction of a second. I caught it. Something darker lurked beneath, a shadow I hadn't seen until now. The man who named every hidden trail, who whispered the local secrets with impossible accuracy, was no longer just a companion. He was a keeper of something dangerous. "Who's there?" I managed, voice tight and brittle. The door creaked wider, and the figure stepped inside, bringing with him a cold that seemed to seep into the room, with its faint smell of dust and decay itself. The floorboards groaned under his weight. I blinked against the sudden chill and found myself staring at Tomas, his face pale, lips pressed tight, eyes darting nervously despite his steady voice. "You don't understand," he said, glancing at Lyle and the others. "You should leave. Now." I swallowed hard. Tomas wasn't a stranger. He was the village's unofficial historian, the man who told us the stories, the warnings about those who vanished. But his urgency was new, raw. "Why?" I asked, heart stammering. "What haven't you told us?" He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Because it's not just a forest anymore. It's us. The people here. And if you dig too deep, you won't like what you find." That was the moment I realized the truth wasn't buried in shadows or myths. It was in the faces around me, in the silence between words, in the way the village breathed beneath the surface, uneasy, watchful, waiting. Hours passed in a blur. Tomas told us what he dared, fractured stories of disappearances, of hikers who never returned, of a network of fear and silence that kept the village intact. He named names, places I recognized from my old reports. The same trails, the same whispers I'd heard long ago, now tangled with the lives before me. Lyle listened quietly, eyes narrowing. When Tomas finished, he leaned forward, voice low. "You think you're safe because you left the city, because you walked into the woods. But the danger isn't out there. It's right here, in the stories we tell and the secrets we keep. His words settled like a stone in my chest. I looked around the cramped room, at the firelight dancing across tired faces. The villagers weren't monsters, not in the usual sense. They were something else, guardians of a fragile peace built on silence, on unspoken rules. That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay on the hard cot, the rough blanket scratching my skin, the wind's howl a relentless companion. I thought about the hikers who vanished, the reports I'd filed, the empty spaces where answers should have been. And I thought about Lyle and the others, their knowledge so precise it felt like a map of a hidden world I'd never fully understood. Morning came slow and gray, the village coated in mist. Tomas was gone, vanished as quietly as he appeared. The others packed their gear with practiced efficiency, no words exchanged about the night's revelations. I stayed behind a moment longer, stepping outside into the damp chill. The air smelled of wet pine and smoke, the ground soft beneath my boots. Somewhere distant, a dog barked, a sharp, lonely sound that echoed across the empty fields. I realized then that nothing would be the same. The past I tried to bury wasn't just a memory, it was a living thing, tangled with the present in ways I hadn't anticipated. The hikers' cases weren't cold files anymore, they were stories with faces, voices, secrets. On the trail back to the road, I noticed the markers, faint carvings on trees, small stones stacked like silent sentinels. Lyle's voice echoed in my mind, naming each one, weaving them into a narrative I couldn't ignore. I wanted to ask why. Why had they shared their knowledge? Why had the village guarded its secrets so fiercely? But the words caught in my throat. Some questions didn't need answers, not yet. The road stretched ahead, winding through the hills like a ribbon of possibility and regret. I felt the weight of the notebook in my pack, the pages now more than just words, they were proof, a reckoning. I walked on, the cold air biting at my cheeks, the silence pressing close. The village faded behind me, but its echoes lingered. In the years to come, I knew I'd return not to find closure, but to piece together the fragments of a story that refused to end. Because some disappearances don't end with a name or a date. They live on in the spaces between, in the trails no one dares to follow, in the faces that vanish but never quite leave. And as I moved forward, I understood that I was no longer just a reporter. I was part of the story now, tangled in the shadows that stretched beyond the forest, beyond the village, beyond the truth I thought I'd known. The past had clawed its way back. And I had no choice but to face it. Story 5, Endless Twilight Cabin, Time and Silence Distort. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I was standing at the window, staring out at the endless twilight that had settled over the landscape. The sky wasn't quite day, not quite night, just an unchanging wash of pale gray and washed-out pink. It blurred the horizon, made the line between earth and sky a vague suggestion. The ground outside looked cracked, like the skin of an old apple left too long on the counter. Some patches of moss had turned a dull brown instead of their usual green, and the few trees around the cabin leaned slightly, as if tired or confused. I tapped a finger against the glass. The pane was cold, rough with condensation on the inside, and I could smell a faint trace of wood smoke lingering from the stove. It was my own breath fogging up the window. I swallowed down the dryness in my throat and tried to remember the last time I checked the date. The calendar on the wall was useless in this place. Days melted into each other without sun or moon to mark their passing. I'd come here to get away from everything, the noise, the clutter, the constant hum of other people's lives. I told myself I needed the isolation, the quiet to think. But the quiet here was different. It wasn't peaceful. It had a weight. Like the air was holding its breath, waiting. I turned away from the window and rubbed my arms. The cabin was small but cozy, the kind of place you'd imagine in a postcard, Rough-hewn logs, a low ceiling, a simple kitchen with peeling paint on the cupboards. There was a single chair by the table where I sat most evenings, a worn armchair by the stove, and a bed that creaked whenever I shifted. I liked that last bit. It was a reminder I was still real, still grounded in something solid. The wood stove crackled softly, filling the room with a dry warmth that smelled like pine and old smoke. I'd gotten used to the sound, the occasional pop or hiss, but tonight it seemed distant, as if it belonged to someone else's world. Outside, I could hear the wind. Not the biting, howling kind I'd expected when I first arrived, but a low, shifting moan that rattled the loose shutters against the cabin walls. I pulled on a sweater and grabbed my notebook from the table. I'd started writing again since I came here, though what I was writing wasn't always clear. Mostly observations, bits of conversation with myself, sketches of the land and the sky. Sometimes I jotted down the strange animal calls that echoed through the silence. They didn't sound like anything I recognized, no birds, no wolves, no foxes. More like a muffled, wood cough or a distant, broken whistle. I tried to track them on a map I'd drawn of the area, but they kept moving, shifting in pitch and direction like the land itself was unsettled. I flipped open the notebook and stared at the last entry. It was dated 5 days ago. I must have missed a few entries somewhere. That was the problem. Time was slippery here. I couldn't pin it down. I wasn't sure if the days were longer or shorter, or if they even mattered anymore. The silence pressed in again. I closed the notebook and stood up, stretching my stiff shoulders. I walked over to the door and looked out through the small window and set in the wood. The landscape stretched out, endless and pale, with no sign of movement except for the occasional flicker of a shadow between the trees. I thought I saw a dark shape crouching low, but when I blinked, it was gone. That was when I heard it, the first human voice since I arrived. It was faint, barely a whisper, tarried on the wind. I pressed my ear to the door, heart ticking a little faster. The voice wasn't shouting or calling, just a soft, uneven murmur. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something urgent in the tone, something that didn't belong to this quiet, frozen place. "Hello?" I called out, stepping outside onto the porch, the wood cold and rough beneath my bare feet. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and thawing moss. The voice came again, this time closer, but still distant enough to feel like a trick. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and scanned the tree-line. No one. Just the skeletal branches of birch and spruce, swaying in the wind. I shook my head. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks. Maybe I was imagining things. I told myself to stop letting the silence get under my skin, to remember why I was here in the first place. But as I turned back toward the cabin, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I blinked hard, and it vanished. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something else. Unease, maybe. Or the realization that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Back inside, I locked the door, though I knew it wouldn't keep anything out. Outside, the strange call started up again, rising and falling like the land itself was breathing unevenly, as unstable as I felt. I sat down at the table, the notebook open in front of me. I wrote the words, slow and deliberate, "Someone is out there." Or something is pretending to be. The twilight stretched on, endless and unchanging, swallowing the horizon and my sense of time. The silence pressed against the walls, the windows, the floor beneath my feet. And I wondered, for the first time, what it would mean if the land itself was breaking down faster than I could survive. The night dragged on like a weight pressing down on my chest. I sat at the table, staring at the scribbled words in my notebook, the ink smudged by a trembling hand. Someone was out there. Or something pretending to be. The thought gnawed at me, sharper than the biting cold outside. When the strange calls began again, rising and falling in that eerie, uneven rhythm, I pressed my forehead to the cool wood of the table. The sound wasn't any animal I knew, not exactly. It was a warped echo, like a bird's cry stretched thin, or maybe a wolf's howl swallowed by the wind. I couldn't place it. It felt wrong, like the land was losing its familiar voice. I didn't sleep. Instead, I paced the small cabin, listening for any sign that the figure I'd seen was returning. The window showed nothing but the endless twilight, a pale glow that blurred the edges of the trees. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the dim light that cast long, dancing shadows, or my mind playing games, but my hands kept shaking, and the memory of that tall, thin shadow stayed sharp. Morning came without warning. The light outside didn't change much, just a faint shift in the color of the sky, like the sun was too tired to rise fully. I pulled on my jacket, laced my boots, and stepped outside. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet earth and decay, a bitter reminder that the permafrost was no longer permanent. The ground beneath my feet felt softer than it should have, with patches of damp moss where ice used to hold firm. I checked the perimeter, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing. But then I noticed something odd, tracks in a thin layer of frost, leading away from the cabin and into the forest. They were too large to be a fox or a lynx, and oddly spaced, like whoever or whatever was walking out here didn't quite know how to place their feet. I crouched down, brushing frost off the earth. The prints were muddled but unmistakable. Something had been here recently. Not just passing through, but circling. Watching. Back inside, I spread a map over the counter, marking the tracks and the direction they took. I had to be methodical about this. Panic wouldn't help me. I needed to figure out what I was dealing with. My fingers traced the thin lines of the map, following the path toward a cluster of frozen streams I'd avoided before because the ground there was notoriously unstable. I remembered the figure's shape, tall, thin, slipping between the trees like a shadow. No face. No sound, except those impossible calls. I wondered if the tracks belonged to them. Could someone really be out here, moving silently through this shifting permafrost, watching me? The thought made a cold sweat break out on my back. I dug out my old camera from the shelf, dusted off the lens, and checked the battery, half dead, but enough for a few shots. I also took the small flashlight and a tape recorder, hoping to capture those strange sounds. If I could document something concrete, maybe I'd have proof that I wasn't losing my mind. By mid-afternoon, the twilight had deepened into a dull gray. The air tasted faintly metallic, like the ground was bleeding something I couldn't identify. I stepped cautiously toward the edge of the forest, the camera slung around my neck, the recorder in my pocket. Every crunch of frost beneath my boots sounded loud in the silence. My breath came out in small clouds, the cold biting at my cheeks. The tracks reappeared, leading toward the frozen streams. I moved slowly, trying not to disturb anything. Then I heard it, a low, guttural call from deeper in the woods. It was an animal, not really. It had a strange rhythm, like a distorted moan, or maybe a voice stretched thin by distance and cold. Hard to believe, I know. I stopped, heart hammering, and held the camera steady. I aimed the lens toward the sound, but all I saw was the shifting snow and the gray shapes of trees bowing under the weight of ice. The call echoed again, closer this time, and I fumbled with the recorder to capture it. A dry crackle, then the strange, broken note, rising and falling like the land itself was gasping for breath. I swallowed hard. The rational part of me wanted to turn back. The part that had been alone for too long whispered that I wasn't alone anymore. Suddenly, a twig snapped just behind me. I spun around, the camera raised, but there was nothing but frost-covered branches swaying in the weak wind. Still, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there. Someone was watching. I hurried back to the cabin, the silence pressing in tighter with every step. Inside, I closed the door and locked it again, the sound of the bolt sliding home making a hollow click in the quiet. I set the camera and recorder on the table, breath ragged. I pressed play on the recorder. Static. Then the low, haunting call filled the small room. I shivered. It was real. Not a dream. Not a trick. I sat down, fingers trembling, and played it again. The sound was broken, unnatural. Like the land was calling out in pain, or warning me to leave. The thought struck me hard. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding what was happening to this place and to me. I pulled the notebook closer and wrote, "They're here. Watching. Waiting. The land is changing faster than I can follow." Outside, the twilight thickened. The calls rose again, more urgent, more desperate. And I realized I wasn't just running out of time. I was running out of options. The weight of the night pressed down on me as the calls rose again, slicing through the dimness like a thread pulled tight. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight and hollow, as if the air itself was resisting me. The cabin's single bulb flickered overhead, casting long, trembling shadows across the rough-hewn walls. I reached out and gave the switch a sharp tap. The light steadied. For now. I glanced at the notebook again. They're here. Watching. Waiting. The words seemed heavier now, almost like a warning carved into stone. But who were they? Not animals. Not ghosts. Something else. Something human. I rubbed my eyes and stood, the floorboards creaking underfoot. Outside, the twilight thickened into a gray wash that blurred the horizon, swallowing the shapes of broken trees and cracking ice. The permafrost was shifting faster than I could track, the ground groaning and buckling like the earth itself was sick. I had to move. I had to do something. The window rattled suddenly, a soft knock tapping insistently against the glass. A cold gust slipped through the cracked frame. My heart jumped. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was out there, just beyond the fragile barrier of wood and glass. I backed away slowly, hands spread flat on the rough plaster wall, trying to make sense of the pounding in my ears. My mind darted to the old radio set up in the corner. Maybe I could get a signal, call someone. Anyone. But the static on the receiver was relentless, a white noise that swallowed every attempt at connection. I crouched near the window, peering out into the dim landscape. Tracks marred the snow, irregular and half-melted, leading away from the cabin toward the broken tree-line. Not animal prints. Human footprints, muddied and uneven, as if whoever left them was struggling against the thawing ground. I swallowed hard. This place was no longer just a refuge. It was a trap. The next day arrived sluggishly, the sky a dull smear of color that offered little relief. I stayed glued to the cabin, eyes darting to every sound, the snap of ice, the groan of shifting earth, the distant, untraceable calls that echoed like warnings. I tried to piece together what I'd recorded, playing the eerie calls over and over, hoping for a clue. Then, a faint crackling on the radio. My breath caught. I adjusted the dial, scanning through static and white noise. A voice, low and broken, whispered through the speakers. Not a signal, not really, it was more like someone trying to speak, struggling against interference. Help, can't hear. The words were fragmented, but unmistakable. I grabbed the radio and pressed the makeshift antenna toward the window. The voice came again, clearer but still desperate. Leaving, no way, ground, broken. The message was chilling. Someone else was out here, somewhere in the shifting permafrost. Trapped or hiding. I felt the cold seep deeper into my bones. This was no accident. No random blip in the wilderness. I needed to find that person, or at least figure out what was happening before the ground gave way completely. Hours passed. I scribbled notes, marking the coordinates from the radio signal's faint clues, matching them to the cracked map pinned to the wall. The permafrost wasn't just thawing, it was collapsing, swallowing the land and distorting the natural rhythms of the place. The calls I heard, maybe they weren't animal sounds at all. Maybe they were echoes of human suffering, distorted by the cracked earth. Night fell again, colder now. I shivered under a threadbare blanket, staring at the dim glow of the radio. Another voice crackled through, urgent, fractured. Don't trust there. The message ended abruptly, replaced by static. I slammed my fist on the table, breath catching. The ambiguity gnawed at me. Who were they? And why was I being warned? The cabin door creaked. The lock was still secure, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there, watching, just like I'd feared. I moved quietly to the door, peering through the peephole. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, silhouetted against the broken light. Too far for me to see clearly, but unmistakably human. Their posture was tense, as if waiting or maybe hoping I'd come out. I swallowed the sudden dryness in my mouth. Opening the door wasn't an option. Not yet. But staying silent felt like surrender. I called out, voice steady but low. Hello? Who's there? No answer. Just the rustling of broken branches and the distant, unsettling calls that seemed to echo around me like a chorus of lost souls. The figure moved closer, then stopped. I could hear a faint rasping, like heavy breathing. Then a whisper, barely audible. You don't know what you're in. A shiver ran down my spine. The words were a warning, or maybe a threat. I wanted to ask who they were, what they meant, but the cold air closed around me like a cage. I stepped back, heart hammering. The door didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a line I couldn't cross, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to. I sank back into the chair, hands trembling. The land was breaking down, faster than I could manage. The people out there, whoever they were, had no way out, just like me. The permafrost wasn't just thawing. It was swallowing more than earth. It was swallowing time, memory, safety. I was trapped, and there was no going back. The night didn't end. It just stretched and crept around me like a cold, slow fog, thickening until I couldn't tell if the shadows were mine or something else's. I sat in the chair by the window, hands still trembling, the whisper echoing in my ears. You don't know what you're in. Those words wouldn't leave me alone. They weren't a threat. Not really. Not like I expected. They were a warning. Or maybe a confession. Outside, the strange calls continued, low, guttural sounds that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. I pressed my ear against the rough wooden frame. The permafrost beneath my feet groaned softly, the ground shifting as if the earth itself were breathing, struggling. I had no idea how long I'd been sitting there, but the twilight outside hadn't changed. Time was a thick, sticky thing here, impossible to measure. Then, movement, a shape, pale against the darkened trees. Closer this time. I could make out a figure, hunched and slow, almost reluctant. The rasping breath came again, ragged and uneven. You shouldn't be here, the voice said, low and cracked. A man. A real person. I swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. Who are you? The figure stayed silent, watching. I could smell it then, damp earth, sweat, something metallic, like rusted iron. A smell that made my skin crawl. I wanted to back away, but the cabin's door was behind me, the window beside me, and the cold night pressing in all around. No escape. Not yet. Why? I asked, voice steadier this time. Why warn me? He shifted. Because this place, it's breaking. And the people who come here, they don't leave. Not really. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. I'm not leaving. Not yet. You probably think I'm imagining things. I have to understand. A bitter laugh, hollow and short. Understand what? That the land's dying? That the ice is melting faster than anyone wants to admit? That whatever's out there, the sounds you hear, they're not animals anymore? There's something else. Something desperate. The words sank in like ice water. Desperate. That's what I've been feeling, without knowing why. A creeping despair that wasn't mine alone. People? I pressed. Are you saying there are others? Like you? He nodded once. Not many. Fewer every year. We're the ones who stayed when everyone else ran. The ones who know the cost. I wanted to ask what cost. What had happened here. But the wind picked up, rattling the cabin walls, and the figure slipped back into the shadow of the trees. I didn't move for a long time, listening to the unnatural chorus outside, the slow groan of the earth. Then I opened the door, stepping out into the cold that bit at my skin. The snow underfoot was patchy, melting and refreezing in a strange rhythm. I could smell decay in the air, cold and heavy with silence, faint but unmistakable. Something was rotting beneath the ice. Wait, I called after him, voice cracking. Tell me your name. No answer. Just the soft crunch of boots on snow as he disappeared into the night. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in. I wanted to slam the door shut, lock myself away from whatever was out there. But the truth was, I couldn't. Not when I was being watched. Not when I was already part of this. I turned back inside, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the latch. The room smelled of old wood and something sour, like forgotten sweat or dried blood. I couldn't tell anymore. The twilight dimmed, shadows pooling in the corners. I sat down at the table, pulling out the notebook I'd been scribbling in since I arrived. The pages were filled with line after line of observations, animal calls, shifting permafrost, vanishing days. But none of it captured the feeling, the slow unraveling, the encroaching silence that wasn't silence at all. I heard a noise then, soft at first, like a breath or a sigh. I froze. The cabin's single window rattled gently in its frame. Someone was outside. Watching. I moved toward the window, heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst. Peering out, I saw nothing but empty snow and twisted trees. Yet the feeling didn't leave me. Something was there. Waiting. I backed away slowly, eyes never leaving the glass. The calls from the forest rose again, a strange symphony of desperation and pain. I realized then that I wasn't just losing track of time. I was losing myself. Why had I come here? To escape? To find peace? The answers were slipping through my fingers like thawing ice. The land was swallowing everything: memory, hope, safety. And now, it seemed, it was swallowing me too. I needed to know more. I had to find that man again. But when I stepped outside, the snow had changed. Footprints too large for mine pressed deep into the softening ground, leading away from the cabin and into the endless twilight. I didn't want to follow. Every instinct screamed at me to run back inside, lock every door, pretend the world outside didn't exist. But I couldn't. There was something in those tracks. something waiting for me to understand. The cold seeped through my clothes, biting at my skin. My breath came out in ragged clouds. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and rot and something I couldn't name. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped forward. The forest swallowed me up, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The calls grew louder, closer. I thought I heard voices, whispers tangled in the wind, but when I stopped to listen, only the cold remained. Then, just ahead, a figure emerged from the shadows, taller than the last, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. No words. Just a look that held too many questions, and too much warning. I swallowed my fear, straightened my back. "I'm not leaving," I said quietly. "Not until I know what this place is." The figure nodded once, almost sadly. "Then you're already part of it." I woke to the sound of crunching outside. At first, I thought it was the ice shifting beneath the cabin again, an all too familiar groan of the permafrost breaking apart. But this was different. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, cautious. Too heavy for an animal. Too steady for the wind. The room was dim, the faint twilight seeping through the frost-coated window, casting long shadows across the cluttered floor. I sat up, my hands trembling as the cold seeped through the thin blanket. I didn't want to believe it, but the feeling settled deep in my chest. I wasn't alone. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, but my fingers fumbled. My breath hitched in my throat. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, a place to disappear into the vast, frozen nothingness. Instead, it had shrunk into a trap, every creak and snap outside a warning. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs over the side of the bed. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Complete silence. Then, a faint tapping at the door, a slow, measured rhythm that made my skin crawl. I pressed my ear against the wood. No voice. No rustling. Just that tapping, like a code, a message I couldn't understand. My mind raced back over the last few weeks. The endless twilight that blurred days into nights. The strange, untraceable calls echoing through the snow, something not quite animal, not quite human. I'd convinced myself it was exhaustion, isolation playing tricks on me. But now, hearing those deliberate knocks, I could no longer deny it. Someone was out there. I moved slowly toward the door, each step a crunch against the frozen floorboards. The cabin smelled faintly of stale coffee and damp wool, with a sharp edge of burning kerosene from the stove. I hesitated, then peered through the peephole. The world outside was a blur of white and gray, the shifting permafrost cracking and twisting in the dim light. No one. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to step back, a voice, soft, barely audible, whispered from the other side. "Help me." My breath caught. It was a woman's voice, desperate, broken. The sound scraped at my nerves, a reminder that I wasn't the only one struggling in this frozen wasteland. I wanted to open the door, to pull her inside, away from whatever was out there. But a part of me hesitated. Who exactly was she? What had brought her here? The isolation had already eaten away at my sense of trust. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Please," she said again, voice cracking. "I didn't mean to come here. I'm lost." The tapping resumed, more urgent now. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, the metal cold against my skin. When I pulled it open, the wind slammed against me, sharp and biting. She was there, pale, wrapped in layers of torn fabric, eyes wide and wild. "Come inside," I said, stepping back. She stumbled in, and I closed the door behind her, the lock clicking into place. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, heavier. The quiet was broken by her ragged breathing. I offered her some water, but she shook her head, eyes darting toward the window. "They're out there," she whispered. "Watching." I wanted to ask who they were, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was, I had my own demons out there, unseen, but no less real. "Sit down," I said, guiding her to the worn couch. Her hands were shaking, fingers stained with dirt. "What happened?" She hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "I was with a group. We thought we could survive the winter here. But people started disappearing. One by one. I ran." Her story spilled out in fragments: paranoia, fear, shadows moving just beyond sight. She hadn't seen anyone directly, but the feeling of being hunted haunted her every step. I recognized the same terror that had gripped me. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was a slow erosion of the mind. I shared my own experience: the shifting ground, the strange calls, the endless twilight that made time meaningless. She nodded, eyes darkening with understanding. "It's not just the cold," she said. "It's breaking us." We sat in silence, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin settling into the permafrost. Outside, the wind howled, carrying distant calls that neither of us could place. The night stretched on, endless and unyielding. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, not because the danger was gone, but because I wasn't facing it alone. We talked through the night, sharing memories and fears, grounding each other against the creeping madness. Morning came slow, the pale light filtering through the frost. The world outside was still shifting, cracks spiderwebbing through the snow, the permafrost sinking unevenly beneath the weight of the season. But inside, there was a fragile warmth. We made a plan. Not to escape, there was no easy way out, but to endure. To watch each other's backs when the silence became too loud. To hold on to whatever humanity remained. I looked at her then, this stranger who had crossed into my frozen world, and something inside me shifted. I realized that survival wasn't just about the land or the cold. It was about connection, about resisting the slow unraveling of self. The strange calls continued, still echoing through the endless twilight. The permafrost still cracked and groaned beneath our feet. But now, there was a shared breath between us, a quiet defiance against the breaking world. As the sun dipped low again, painting the sky with muted blues and grays, I closed my eyes and listened, not just to the silence, but to the steady rhythm of another heartbeat beside me. We would survive. Somehow, we would survive. Story 6, Lost Hours, Unseen Steps into Darkness. I woke up with my head pounding like I'd been hit by a hammer and the faint, persistent smell of gasoline thick in the air. Last night. That was the problem. I had no memory of the last 4 hours. 4 hours just. Gone. The clock on the dash blinked 6:12 a.m., but my mind was blank. No memories, no flashes, just a dull ache behind my eyes and the buzzing silence of the car. No radio, no notifications, just me and the faint hum of the engine's standby mode. I glanced over at my phone, lying face up on the passenger seat. The screen was cracked, which wasn't new, but the battery was nearly dead. I reached for it, thumb fumbling over the glass, and unlocked it as fast as I could. The screen lit up, and my heart sank a little. Dozens of photos. Hundreds, really. All of me. That was the thing. I didn't recognize a single one. They were all taken in the last 4 hours, every timestamp precise. Each photo was a snapshot in increasingly unfamiliar places. Some were dimly lit streets with flickering street lamps, others were close-ups of my face, eyes wide, mouth slightly open like I was about to say something, but the background was always the same, the outskirts of town, growing darker, more isolated. It started with a photo of me leaning against a rusted fence near the old mill, a place I'd never been, not willingly. The next was taken from inside a convenience store I didn't recognize, standing awkwardly by a rack of expired magazines. Then a shot of me walking down a cracked sidewalk under a street lamp that buzzed unevenly, shadows pooling under it like ink. The last dozen photos led me closer and closer to a place I only knew from rumors, the abandoned facility on Harper Road. The one everyone said was off limits, a relic from a forgotten era, swallowed by weeds and neglect. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, the phone slipping slightly in my grip. The cold metal of the steering wheel bit into my palms. I tried to breathe steadily, but the tightness in my chest made it hard. Why was I here? Why wasn't I at home? And how did my phone end up with these photos? A soft creak came from the passenger side door, making me jump. I scanned the empty space beside me. Nothing. Just the faint rustling of dry leaves outside. The wind carried something else too, the faint, distant drone of a dog barking, sharp and lonely. I shut the phone off and shoved it into the glove compartment, my fingers still shaking. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd been driving and just pulled over to rest. But the lack of memory was gnawing at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. I stepped out of the car, the early morning air cool and damp against my skin. The parking lot was empty except for a few scattered grocery carts and a single flickering streetlight. It smelled like wet asphalt and something metallic, almost like rusted iron. I ran my hand over the rough plaster wall of the nearby building. The texture was gritty, uneven beneath my fingers. I shivered. I tried to push the strange feeling down, the uneasy pit twisting in my stomach. I told myself it was probably just exhaustion, or maybe a migraine. But I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. The town looked normal enough. Small shops still closed behind metal shutters, the occasional bird fluttering between the power lines. But there was a silence here that felt wrong. The kind of silence that didn't just mean early morning, but something deeper, heavier. I glanced down at my watch. 6:17 a.m. If I was going to get home before my sister woke up, I had to move. But as I slid back into the driver's seat, the phone buzzed softly from the glove compartment. A message. From an unknown number. I swallowed hard, the air thick in my throat. Hesitation caught me. I didn't want to see what it said. But I did anyway. Don't trust the road you took. The screen went black after the message, battery dead. I sat there, heart hammering, fingers gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. The sun was higher now, but the shadows outside the car seemed to stretch longer, darker. I didn't know what had happened to me. I didn't know who had taken those photos, or why they were trying to warn me. But I knew one thing, the abandoned facility wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was the center of whatever had swallowed those 4 hours. And I was going to find out why. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move. The car door creaked open, the stale air outside thick with an uneasy silence. My legs felt heavy as I stepped toward the overgrown path leading to the facility's rusted gates. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but curiosity was a stronger chain. The flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze, a shadow slipping between broken walls, just out of reach. Whoever or whatever was here wasn't finished with me yet. I swallowed hard, pressing forward despite the chill crawling up my spine. The shadow paused, then vanished deeper into the darkness, as if inviting me in. The night air was colder than I expected, sharp enough to sting exposed skin. I took a cautious step forward, then another, letting the uneven ground dictate my pace. The gravel crunched underfoot, a brittle echo in the vast silence that surrounded the facility. The place was a skeleton of rust and decay, windows shattered or boarded up, walls marred by graffiti and peeling paint. It smelled like damp concrete and old oil, something mechanical, long forgotten but not entirely dead. I glanced down at my phone again, fingers trembling as I scrolled through the photos. Each one showed me in a different spot, all leading closer to this place. There was no timestamp I could trust. Some images were blurred, others startlingly clear, but the progression was unmistakable. I had been here before. Not just here, but deeper inside, in places I couldn't remember visiting. A soft rustling came from the brush to my left. My breath hitched, and I froze, heart beating loud enough to drown out everything else. Maybe it was just a stray animal, or the wind shifting the leaves. The thought didn't comfort me. Not really. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I wanted to call out, to break whatever silence had settled like a shroud, but my voice stuck somewhere between my throat and my lungs. I took out the phone, flicking on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cracked concrete and twisted metal. I moved toward a low archway, a doorless entrance, half collapsed and swallowed by vines. The photo showed me standing just inside that arch. My fingers grazed the rough surface of the wall, cold and crumbly beneath my touch. Something scraped against the metal nearby, slow and deliberate. I spun around, shining the dim light that cast long, dancing shadows wildly. Nothing. Just shadows. "Hello?" I whispered, voice cracking. "Is someone there?" No reply. Just silence. Complete silence. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air was different here, still, but thick, like it was holding its breath. I could taste the dust on my tongue, dry and bitter. The flashlight flickered. I tapped it with my finger. Steady. Good. The floor was littered with debris, old papers, broken glass, bits of rusted machinery. I shuffled forward, careful not to disturb anything that might make a loud noise. The building creaked around me, settling or protesting, I couldn't tell. My own footsteps sounded alien, like I was intruding on something sacred. I stopped in a large room, the ceiling high but patchy with holes where the roof had given way. Moonlight spilled in, casting pale pools on the cracked tiles. In the corner, something caught the light, a stack of papers, yellowed and curled. I approached, heart pounding, and picked one up. It was a blueprint. Not just any blueprint, but one of the facility itself. The lines were faded but precise, showing rooms and hallways, staircases leading down. A small section was circled in red, the ink bleeding through the page. The words were almost illegible, but I made out control room and beneath it, restricted access. I stuffed the paper into my pocket, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. There was a faint hum, low and mechanical, coming from somewhere below me. I hadn't heard it before. The building wasn't dead after all. I pulled out my phone, checking the photos again. The last few pictures showed me standing in front of a heavy metal door, the same design I'd seen in the blueprint labeled control room. My fingers trembled as I zoomed in on one image. Behind me, just beyond the door, was a figure, blurred but unmistakably watching. My breath caught. Who was that? Why hadn't I remembered them before? Panic rose, sharp and sudden, but I forced it down. I needed answers, not fear. As if on cue, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. A faint vibration buzzed in my pocket, the phone. I almost dropped it, pulling it out to see a new message. No number. No name. Just a single line of text. You're closer than you think. Don't trust the light. I stared at the screen, the glow harsh in the dim room. The message made no sense. Was it a warning? A threat? My mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the night. I shivered and looked up, suddenly hyper-aware of the shadows stretching around me. The moon had slipped behind a cloud, plunging the room into near darkness. The flashlight flickered again, then went out. Nothing but black. My pulse thundered in my ears. I fumbled with the phone, trying to turn the light back on, but the screen was frozen. Dead. I swallowed the lump in my throat and took a step backward. The mechanical hum had stopped. The silence was absolute. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, measured. Not mine. I didn't want to look. I wanted to run. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. Who's there? My voice barely rose above a whisper. No answer. Just the sound of footsteps, stopping. Then, nothing. A breath. A shift in the air. I finally forced myself to turn, phone clutched tight, eyes straining to find anything. The faint outline of a figure flickered at the edge of the doorway, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I blinked. It was gone. I backed away, heart hammering, every nerve screaming to flee. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew now I wasn't alone. Whoever had taken those photos, whoever had left that message, they were here. Watching. Waiting. I had to get out. But as I hurried toward the exit, a cold thought settled in my gut. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was personal. And the next time we met, I wouldn't be so lucky. My breath hitched in the cold air as the footsteps ceased, swallowed by the heavy silence that seemed to press against my skin. There was something about the way those footsteps had stopped, too deliberate, like a predator deciding whether to strike or wait. Then the breath. A subtle shift in the stale air that made every hair on my arm stand on end. It wasn't just someone watching. It was something calculated. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. Who are you? I whispered again, this time louder, the words cracking against the silence. No answer. Just the faint hum of the building settling around me, the old pipes groaning like they had a story to tell. My eyes darted, searching for any sign of movement, a flicker of light, a sound, anything to break the stillness. The doorway was empty. The figure was gone, vanished like a bad dream slipping away with the dawn. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst through my ribs. The exit was just a few steps away, but my mind was tangled in a web of confusion and dread. Why was I here? Who had taken those photos? And what did they want? Each unanswered question was a weight dragging me down. I forced myself to move, one hesitant step after another, until I reached the door. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle, but when I pulled, the door didn't budge. Locked. Of course it was locked. I wasn't exactly in a friendly place. Panic fluttered in my chest, sharp and sudden. I looked around the dim hallway, the flickering overhead light casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on cracked walls. Then I heard it. A low, measured voice from somewhere deeper in the building. You're not leaving. The words were calm, almost casual, but they sliced through me like ice. I spun toward the sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, heart racing, eyes wide. There was no one in sight. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message. I pulled it out with shaking hands. The screen showed a new photo. Me, standing in front of the building's rusted entrance, eyes wide, face pale. But the thing that made my stomach drop was the timestamp. It was taken just minutes ago. I swallowed hard, the taste of metal rising in my mouth. This wasn't some random stalker or prank. This was someone inside the building, someone close enough to be watching me, controlling the narrative. And they wanted me trapped. I backed away from the door, heart pounding so hard I was sure it would betray me. The hallway felt claustrophobic, the air thick and stale. My mind raced, trying to piece together what little I knew. The photos on my phone weren't just random snapshots. They were breadcrumbs, leading me here, to this place, to whoever was waiting. There was no turning back. A sudden noise made me freeze. The soft scrape of shoes against concrete echoing down the corridor. Not hurried footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The same rhythm as before. Closer, closer. I ducked into a nearby room, the door creaking shut behind me. The air inside was colder, damp, smelling of mold and rust. I pressed my back against the rough plaster, trying to steady my ragged breathing. In the dim light, I noticed a series of old desks, papers scattered, yellowed and torn. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, the last date marked months ago. Time felt suspended here, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My phone buzzed again. Another photo. This time, it was taken from inside the building, showing a corridor lined with doors I hadn't seen before. And in the distance, a figure standing still, watching. I swallowed hard. Whoever this was, they had planned this meticulously. Every step I'd taken, every photo they'd snapped, it was all part of some twisted game. But why me? What did they want? The scrape of footsteps returned, nearer now. My pulse quickened, the cold sweat prickling down my spine. I needed a plan. I couldn't just hide and wait for them to find me. I rummaged through the desk drawers, hoping for something useful, a map, a key, anything. Instead, I found a small, nondescript envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in neat, precise letters. You've come too far to turn back. Stay, or lose everything. The words blurred as my hands trembled. Lose everything? What did that mean? My mind flashed to my car, the full tank of gas, the miles I'd already driven without memory. The photos. The messages. The footsteps. I was trapped. Not just in this building, but in a situation I didn't understand. The lines of safety, of escape, were already gone. I'd crossed some invisible threshold, and now there was no going back. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Through the cracked door, a shadow passed. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I could hear the soft scrape of their shoes, the faint rustle of clothing. Look, I heard a voice, low and calm, just beyond the door. You can't leave. Not now. Not after everything. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed to run, to fight, to scream. But the truth settled in cold and heavy. This was no accident. No random encounter. This was personal. And I was in the middle of a carefully constructed trap. I slid down against the wall, pulling my knees close. The cold plaster bit through my thin jacket. The silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating, broken only by the slow, steady footsteps pacing outside. I had no idea who they were. No idea what they wanted. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going anywhere. The door handle rattled. A soft click. Then silence. I held my breath. And waited. The silence stretched long enough to sting. My ears strained for the faintest sound beyond the door, but all I heard was my own ragged breathing and the slow, deliberate footsteps pacing just outside. The plaster wall pressed cold and unforgiving against my back, and the thin jacket I'd grabbed this morning did little to stop the chill crawling up my spine. The soft click of the door handle was different this time, more deliberate, a quiet invitation or a warning. I didn't move. Didn't dare. Look, the voice whispered again, low and calm, like a tide pulling me under. You can't leave. Not now. Not after everything. Everything. The word hit me like a wave. What did they mean? What was I supposed to have done? My mind reeled back through the last 4 hours, but there was nothing, just a void, the gap in my memory that felt like a wound. The photos on my phone, the places I didn't remember visiting, the way each one closed in on this damn facility. Nothing made sense. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry, scratchy. Who are you? I tried to sound steadier than I felt, but my voice cracked. The door remained shut, the footsteps resumed their slow circling. No answer came. I pushed myself to my feet, hands pressed flat against the plaster, feeling the rough texture bite into my palms. If I was going to get out of here, I needed to figure out what I was dealing with. Whoever was out there wasn't just some random stranger. This was planned. Personal. I edged toward the door, each step measured and quiet. The small gap beneath it was dark, a thin black line. I crouched low, pressing my ear to the wood. The footsteps stopped. Listen, the voice said again, closer this time, threaded with something I couldn't place, maybe pity, maybe mockery. You don't know what's waiting for you out there. But you're too deep now. You can't turn back. A shiver ran through me, but I forced my eyes forward, scanning the hallway beyond the cracked door. Dim light flickered overhead, the kind of tired fluorescent buzz that set my nerves on edge. The air smelled stale, like damp concrete and forgotten secrets. I glanced down at my phone in my hand, the screen cracked but still glowing softly. The photos. Dozens of them, each one a clue, a breadcrumb trail I hadn't even known I was following. The last one was different, a grainy shot of the facility's main entrance, smeared with shadow, and in the corner, just barely visible, a figure watching me. I swallowed again. The image burned in my mind. That figure wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the dim light that cast long, dancing shadows. It was real. And it was waiting. My fingers trembled, but I forced myself to steady them. I tapped the screen, zooming in on the photo. The figure's eyes caught the light, bright and cold. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been following me. Watching. There was a soft scrape behind the door, like fabric brushing against concrete. The footsteps resumed, slower now, measured. Calculated. Why are you doing this? I whispered, voice barely above the hum of the flickering light. Because you need to remember, the voice said. Because you owe us. The words hit me like a slap. Oh. To whom? And for what? My mind spun, trying to grasp at anything familiar, anything that could explain the nightmare I'd stumbled into. I pressed my ear harder against the door, catching a low murmur, like someone speaking into a phone or maybe a radio. The words were garbled, but I caught containment and protocol and something about the experiment. Experiment. The word tasted bitter. I remembered the facility's reputation, closed decades ago, officially abandoned, but rumors of secret projects and disappearances still whispered among locals. And now I was here, trapped inside its shadow, caught in some twisted game. I stepped back from the door, heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned out the murmurs. My hands were clammy, sweat slicked beneath my palms. I needed a plan. Fast. My phone buzzed in my hand. A message. From an unknown number. Stop looking. It's too late. I stared at the screen, fingers frozen. I still can't explain it. The message made no sense. Too late for what? For running? For fighting? For something worse? The footsteps slowed, stopped. Silence. Complete silence. Then the door handle rattled again, only this time it didn't click. It just shuddered under pressure, as if someone was testing the locks, weighing them against their own patience. I backed away, heart thudding. My eye started to a narrow window near the ceiling, cracked but just out of reach. Fresh air might be out there. Freedom, maybe. But how to get there without drawing attention? A creak echoed from the far end of the hallway, thin and sharp. Something shifted in the shadows, movement faster than footsteps, closer to the wall I'd been leaning against. I spun around, pressing myself flat. My breath caught in my chest. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, lean, face partially hidden by the hood of a jacket. No smile. No greeting. Just eyes, sharp and unreadable. "Let me guess," I said, voice shaking. "You're the one who took those photos." They didn't answer. Instead, they stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The scent of something metallic drifted through the stale air, maybe sweat, maybe something less easy to place. I swallowed. Why me? I tried again. "What do you want from me?" The figure stopped just short of the light, letting the shadows hide their face. "You were part of it," they said quietly. "You just don't remember." A cold wave crashed over me. Part of it? What had I been involved in? The gaps in my memory felt like holes ripped through my mind. "Help me remember," I said, voice barely steady. "Please." They hesitated, then reached into a pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. The sun hummed low when I finally pulled away from the cracked asphalt of that forsaken facility. The smell of dust and rust clung to me like a second skin. My back ached from leaning too long against the cold metal fence, and my fingers still trembled when I held the phone, swiping through those damned photos one last time. Each picture was a fingerprint of a lost 4 hours, me, wandering closer and closer to that place I couldn't remember ever deciding to visit. It wasn't just the photos anymore. It was the silence that pressed down on my chest when I was there, the oppressive quiet that wasn't natural. No birds chirping, no wind through the trees, just an eerie stillness that felt like it was waiting. Waiting for someone to break it. Waiting for me. I kept telling myself to breathe, but my lungs felt tight, as if the air inside the car was thicker than it should be. Outside, the evening breeze rustled dry leaves, and a distant dog barked somewhere down the street. The normal sounds of a town winding down for the night, but inside me, something had shifted. I wasn't the same person who got in the car this morning, or whatever time it was. I fumbled with the phone again, eyes scanning the pictures. There was me standing by a rusted generator, my breath visible in the chilly air, though I couldn't remember shivering. Another showed me sitting on a broken concrete step, hands wrapped around my knees, staring blankly at a locked door. The last one was the most unsettling, me, looking directly at the camera, eyes wide as if I'd just noticed something terrifying. Except I didn't remember taking it. "Why?" I whispered. Why didn't I remember any of this? The question hung between me and the dashboard, unanswered. I wanted to blame sleep deprivation, maybe a blackout, or some kind of fugue, but none of that explained the photos or the gasoline in the tank that had mysteriously filled itself. It was like my body had been on autopilot, a passenger in my own life. I started the engine, the hum filling the car's interior. My hands were slick with sweat, a cold sweat that made me shiver despite the heat of the day fading outside. I drove slowly back toward town, the road stretching out in front of me like an uncertain promise. As I approached the edge of the facility, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The sun was setting fast now, casting long shadows that turned the trees into dark, jagged shapes. The place looked different in the fading light, more sinister, somehow. But I'd been there. I'd walked through that cracked gate and into that labyrinth of shadows, and I couldn't remember a thing. I pulled over near a small diner that still had its neon sign flickering weakly. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried eggs hit me like a wave. I needed something to anchor me, to remind me I was still part of the world that made sense. I ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sat by the window, watching people move about their evening routines. Laughing couples, tired waitresses, a man reading a newspaper. None of them had any idea what I'd been through. I pulled the photos up on my phone again, scrolling slowly. The last few had timestamps that didn't match the times I thought I'd been awake. The earliest was 4 hours ago, the latest about an hour before I woke up in the car. The timestamps were precise, but the memories were ghosts. A voice broke my focus. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the waitress said, setting down a cup of coffee. Her name tag said Linda. She smiled, but her eyes were curious. "Long night?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Something like that." She lingered, then asked, "You want to talk about it?" I hesitated. I wanted to tell her everything, the photos, the lost hours, the abandoned place that felt like a trap. But how do you explain something that sounds like a bad dream? Or worse, like you're losing your mind? "No," I said finally, forcing a small smile. "Just tired." Linda gave me a look that didn't quite buy it, but she left me alone. The coffee was bitter and hot, burning the back of my throat, and I held the cup with both hands, trying to steady myself. After a while, I pulled out the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My sister, Sarah. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I needed a lifeline, a reminder of who I was before this whole nightmare started. Her voice was warm but cautious. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said, the word cracking in my throat. "Not really." I told her about waking up in the car, the photos, the place outside town. I left out the part where I thought someone or something had been following me. I wasn't sure if I was paranoid or if that was the truth. She didn't interrupt, just listened. When I finished, she said softly, "We'll figure it out. Together." That meant more than she knew. I drove home slowly, the streets dark now and almost empty. My mind was quieter, but the weight of those missing hours sat heavy in my chest. I still didn't know what happened out there, and maybe I never would. But I'd stopped running from it. If I was going to find answers, I'd have to face the shadows head on. Not with anger or fear, but with whatever strength I had left. At home, I left the phone on the kitchen table and sank into the couch. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe deeply. To remember. The night stretched out, thick and unyielding, but I wasn't alone anymore. There was someone waiting for me on the other end of the line. Someone who knew me. And maybe that was enough. The photos would stay on my phone, silent witnesses to a part of me I couldn't reach yet. But I was here. Awake. And ready to face whatever came next. Silence. Complete silence. Then, finally, sleep.